Flowing in Him Without Me by JACOBO GRINBERG, 1991. Introduction by Bending Realities.
Welcome to the audiobook Flowing in Him Without Me by the renowned Dr. JACOBO GRINBERG, a work that plunges us into the depths of self-knowledge and universal spirituality. In this audiobook, Dr. JACOBO shares his fascinating experiences and learnings gained throughout his many travels around the world, including a remarkable anecdote in India where he had an eye-opening encounter with the famous guru Sai-Baba. Although this experience was not entirely pleasant, it left him with valuable lessons that have influenced his understanding of life and spirituality. Furthermore, in this work, Dr. JACOBO provides us with an exceptional comparison of the mystical models of Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Mexican shamanism, and his own synergistic theory. Through this comparison, he invites us to explore the similarities and differences between these spiritual traditions, offering a unique and enriching perspective on the nature of human existence and the path to self-realization. Get ready to immerse yourself in a transformative journey towards self-knowledge and universal spirituality with JACOBO GRINBERG's Flowing in Him Without Me. This audiobook will lead you to explore the depths of your being and discover new perspectives on life and the universe around you.
Chapter 1: Education for the New Era. A real experience in Mexico. It is Thursday morning and Mexico City dawns foggy. I prepare for the most exhilarating experience of the week, working with the children of Toluca. The 60 kilometers that separate Mexico City from Toluca City are a delight. Forests, lakes, and mountains full of greenery and freshness. I arrive at the Torres Quintero Institute on time at 10 a.m. 400 children study here using training methods that allow them to learn to read at 2.5 years of age. There are children who have read more than 500 books by the age of 10. The first time I visited this institute, I was invited to talk with the children of a 5th grade class. The children surrounded me in a round room built into the ground. I introduced myself, and after 15 minutes, we were discussing the relationship between Dali, the theory of relativity, and postmodernism in Mexican mural painting. I left there thinking that it was not real, and yet it was. I confess that I was worried. Those brilliant children demonstrated the inexistence of limits in education, and that was precisely what was worrying. They would surely outgrow their teachers very soon, and new functions would have to appear in their overstimulated brains. Who would guide them, and where would they go? I expressed my concern to the directors of the institute, and they asked me to collaborate with them. 5 years earlier, I had participated in a development program for the children of another Mexican school located in the city of Cuernavaca. I had taught them extraocular vision and an observation method that was a success but caused a great rejection in the parents' community, who were frightened thinking that their children would become atypical. The mistake was not involving the parents in the program. The same would not happen this time. A week later, we gathered all the parents, and I shared with them the concern about the new roles and the need for their children to learn techniques to become their own guides and teachers, as they would soon surpass all their mentors. They asked me for fuller explanations. I told them that in conventional systems of education, knowledge is imparted from outside, but there is no emphasis or interest in teaching how to learn. If it were possible to impart knowledge and simultaneously activate the guide and teacher in all of us, the latter would point the right way. They agreed. The work with the children began 15 days later. We chose a pilot group representative of children between 9 and 12 years old. For more than 2 hours, we analyzed together what was happening to them, and I proposed to them to work 1 day a week to learn how to learn. Concentration. Learning about oneself means having the ability to observe oneself and to deduce from observation the state in which we function and what we need to correct. To be able to observe our inner self, the fundamental tool is concentration. The work with the children in Toluca was based on the above reasoning. We started the sessions by feeling our bodies, going through them internally, concentrating on our breathing. 25 children and I would stand in different places in the room, close our eyes, and feel our arms, the weight of our body on our legs, the tension in our back and our breathing movements. Then we would jump and scream at the top of our lungs, trying to extract tensions from our bodies, and we would watch ourselves again, attentive to any internal changes. The children amazed me by their seriousness. They looked attentive and concentrated, and some expressed their amazement at noticing bodily signs that I had never detected before. One girl told us that by concentrating on her heart, she had been able to see it pumping her own blood. A statement like this was enough for the other children to understand that such observation was possible, and to try it with their own bodies. The observation. Afterwards, we would relax by lying on our backs. During the analysis session, we had already discussed the possibility of changing the location of the observer. I told them about experiences with other children who were able to change the perspective of observation even in out-of-body locations. I told them that this was not a paranormal or esoteric effect, but a function accessible to everyone, but not very well known. The elders did not exercise it and had forgotten that it could exist. They didn't even teach it in school, but we went to practice it. The children asked me why the school did not teach the most important thing. I answered that I had asked the same question many times without finding an answer. School was supposed to teach us to learn to know ourselves from within, to observe ourselves, to become our own masters, to develop our full potential. But this rarely happened, and now we were going to try. We continued observing and feeling our body, but lying down and relaxed. Observation, to be effective, must be accompanied by an attitude of acceptance. Without acceptance, observation does not fulfill its purpose, which is to know the reality as it is, both of our bodies and internal processes as well as that of the environment. It is accepted in order to have reliable and truthful information. It is accepted in order to achieve self-knowledge, and this modifies. Therefore, if we want to transform something, it is first necessary to accept it and love it as it is. I asked the children to try to make an observation of their whole body as a unit. Then I asked them to try to see themselves as they were, lying down and with the clothes they were wearing. The sign of success was to raise their hand. 15 little arms were raised at first, and then all the rest of the children began to watch from the outside. I asked them to look around the room with their eyes closed and to locate a window. The children began to float like observers above the school. Some were describing the scene to me. So-and-so is playing with so-and-so. The school looks really weird from up there. I asked them to go even higher. They described the city of Toluca from the clouds. More. The blue sky and the quilted clouds below. More. The sky darkens and stars begin to appear. You see the beautiful planet floating in a starry black sky. It looks blue and white and green, and the children in space and me marveling that it was so easy. I brought them back little by little. As they passed through the clouds, they got wet, and as they entered the room through a window, they got in the way. Analysis. The experience was later analyzed. Some children doubted that they had actually traveled. Others were sure they had. They all agreed that it was delightful, and also they had seen the whole earth from the outside and had realized that it was our home and that it floats in the middle of space. They made me promise to take them even further next Thursday. Some wanted to visit Mars, and others some distant galaxy. First the experience and then the correlation with what has already been written. The children had seen Earth, and the next time they visited Mars, and the next time Andromeda. Now they were eager to see if the astronomy books described what they had experienced. They were eager and curious, truly interested, and no one had to force them to study. Rather, they demanded more information from their teachers. Direct knowledge. The Hindus call it samyama, and the technique is described in Patanjali's aphorisms on yoga. If you want to know a flower, become the flower, and you will know it from within. I explained the method to the children. It consisted in deciding what they wanted to know. A flower, water, clouds, one of their internal organs, insects, then apply concentration on it, observing it with great attention. They had to maintain the observation until only the object existed in their consciousness. Little by little, and if they kept the observation long enough, they would merge with the object, becoming it. They listened to me with wide eyes and immediately went out into the garden. They returned after 20 minutes. Each one wanted to tell me what they had discovered. They were really excited. One girl spoke first. She had decided to get to know a flower. She had watched it carefully for several minutes, and then went into it. It was yellow and turned yellow flower. The wind swayed it, and suddenly she felt tickled. A bee had landed inside it. A child spoke next. He had decided to get to know the water. He approached the small school pond and looked at the placid surface of the liquid. He began to be the water, and suddenly became dizzy. Someone had thrown a stone into the pond, and the waves had surprised him and made him dizzy. Another child found an insect. He watched it until he began to feel the throbbing of a tiny green heart. The most subtle case was another child who decided to get to know space. He sat on a bench and concentrated on the air, and then on the foundation of the air, and then on what held the foundation of the air. He had unwittingly dabbled in one of the most sophisticated Buddhist meditation techniques. Meditation. The children of Toluca began to talk about samyama with the utmost naturalness. They applied it to hundreds of objects, and the originality of their descriptions made it delightful to listen to them. I decided to teach them meditation techniques, actually concentration on the breath, on the body, or on various objects, including space, was already meditation. So I was able to introduce the subject as naturally as possible. I told them that meditating was concentrating on an object, and that the technique was more valuable the more subtle the object of observation. Space was much more subtle than a rock, but the subtlest and most valuable thing was to meditate on oneself, trying to do samyama on the self, to get to know who we are. I doubted if they understood, and I guided them the first time. We spent time observing our body, our breath, and finally our self. What words describe the feeling of selfhood and the encounter with the self? There are no descriptions of that, because its existence cannot be reduced to a description. That is why the children were not asked to explain themselves. It was enough to see their smiling faces to realize that some of them had found themselves. Flying. The same boy who had decided to do samyama over space discovered that this could be a suitable technique for flying. He told his classmates, and from there began a whole aeronautical movement among the kids. They discovered that it was more difficult than they had imagined. In the first place, it was not enough to merge with space or to make efforts. What's more, straining seemed to increase the weight instead of decreasing it. Then they discovered that the desire to fly prevented levitation. It seemed that it was necessary to desire it without desiring it, and to merge without merging. To this day, none have succeeded, although some say they have already felt a slight detachment. Extraocular vision. What most of these children did achieve was extraocular vision. Before explaining what it consists of, I would like to mention what we learned from the flying experience and in general from all the procedures so far described, including samyama. We discovered that it does not matter so much to reach the fulfillment of the desire, whether it is to become a flower, to see the earth from space, or to fly. What matters is the process. The children themselves discovered this, when one of them boasted of having achieved something better than his peers or simply different. The others criticized him. They told them that if they continued to boast about the results of their attempts, they would miss out on the most fun, which was precisely the whole process, regardless of its success or failure. I believe that this is no longer knowledge alone, but true wisdom. I introduced extraocular vision after a whole discussion about reality and the perception of reality. The least I wanted was to introduce extraocular vision as an isolated phenomenon detached from the rest. Rather, I wanted the children to see in it a demonstration of an extreme but normal perceptual act, illustrative of the very basis of the creation of conscious experience. I based it on the teachings of the greatest Mexican shamans, who believe that by knowing the way we perceive, we can know everything, because we will understand the fundamentals of the creation of reality. Extraocular vision is the ability to see images, but without using the eyes, but some other part of our body, usually the palms of our hands. The training of extraocular vision consists of concentrating on the body, on the breath, and on activating a line of energy that connects the palms of the hands with the space between the eyebrows. Children with a good ability to concentrate and who are not older than 16 years learn to see with their hands from the first training session. The freer the child is, i.e., the less rigid, the faster he or she will learn. As I mentioned before, I had already successfully tested the method with the children of Cuernavaca, with whom I discovered that the activation of extraocular vision stimulated a series of correlated functions. These, in the order in which they appeared, were extraocular vision with the palms of the hands, extraocular vision with any other area of the body, extraocular vision without the need for contact, intracorporeal vision, healing, direct communication ability, and various mind-matter interaction effects. Here is a brief description of the sequence. First, the child learns to see with his hands by touching the graphic material. Then he learns to see with any part of the body, which in a next phase he removes from direct contact. The child can see without the eyes at a distance. For example, he reads a printed page without touching it, or sees his environment. The vision of the environment is 360 degrees. Later, the child is able to see inside the body of his peers or his own body even in the dark. When this happens, a kind of telepathic ability begins to be activated, in which the child recognizes the thoughts of its child or adult peers. Intracorporeal vision and the ability to communicate directly allow the child to be able to heal. Finally, the child who has gone through all the previous phases begins to be able to affect objects, moving them from their place without touching them. The Toluca children repeated the above sequence but at an astonishing speed, reaching the 7th phase very quickly. When one of these children learned to see extraocularly, his classmates asked him to demonstrate it to them, and this was enough to activate the function in them. In this way, in a few days, more than 50 children of the Institute could already see extraocularly, and some of them taught the others. The teachers. We decided from the first session with the children to extend the training to the teachers. I wanted to avoid repeating the failure of Cuernavaca and also to ensure continuity of the techniques. As hard as I tried, I could not give the training to 400 children alone, so teaching the teachers would ensure that the training would be extended to all. The same sessions as for the children were given to the school teachers, but the results were very poor in terms of the mentor's mastery, but very satisfactory in that the mentors accepted the methodology and considered it a formal part of the curriculum. At present, the Torres Quintero Institute in Toluca City is the first educational institution in Mexico that has incorporated these self-knowledge techniques into its curricula. I hope that this model will be extended to other schools and, in the future, to the entire Mexican educational system. Chapter 2. In Search of the Light. An encounter with Mayan shamanism. It is hot in Rishikesh, so hot that the only remedy for not sweltering is to plunge into the icy and refreshing Ganges. In a small bookstore next to the river, I found a treasure, an original text describing an ancient meditation technique. the Mahamudra. I was fascinated to read it. It affirms that all experience arises from the same source, and that this source can be known by observing the origin of every thought, every image or sound. I have practiced it sitting on the sand, watching the tiny waves forming on the riverbank. Later, when walking through the city market, I have tried to focus my attention on the origin of the orders that activate my steps. Later, when getting angry with a store clerk who wanted to cheat me, the text is right. If one attends to the origin of all experience, one establishes contact with a sort of mirror of reality that is unaltered by the modifications of experience, and that only reflects its foundations, its basic luminosity and refulgent author. Soon, I begin to encounter obstacles and to need a guide, a teacher. I am in India, and Mahamudra is a Buddhist technique. The gurus do not know it. I decide to look in Nepal and in a monastery near Kathmandu. Lama Lundrup answers me with a laconic, "Mahamudra is you," when I ask him for a lama who wants to guide me in the practice. I return to Rishikesh and meditate at Sivananda's tomb in the Temple of the Divine Life Society. I observe myself and keep observing until I recognize my center and integrate into myself. The environment is clear and serene, and the sunlight penetrates through the main door of the temple, warming the atmosphere. I go out, and a dark-haired girl of robust complexion catches my attention. Something in her energy is familiar to me. I approach her, and when she confesses her Jewish origin, I confirm my impression. I am Jewish too. Scars on her arms catch my attention. She tells me that before India she lived in Cancun, dedicated to hunting crocodiles and learning about herself with the help of her teacher, Don Panchito de Tixualactan, a 130-year-old Mayan shaman. I recognize in the encounter a sign, and I know that my next destination will be the Yucatan Peninsula. The only way to reach Don Panchito is through Doña Sara, his main disciple. I meet Doña Sara in Cancun, and she subjects me to a dozen tests and an intense interrogation before agreeing to introduce me to her master. She wants to be sure of the goodness of my intentions and the quality of my energy. She finally agrees, and in the early morning she sends a message to Don Panchito through a wake. She lights a candle, concentrates on it, and sends her thought, "Jacobo and we will arrive tomorrow at 11 a.m. The road to Tixualactan is magical. We cross a kind of vegetal tunnel tinged by a penetrating energy that leads to a small town typical of the central zone of the Yucatecan Peninsula. Several women dressed in flowers collect water from a deep cenote, and a centenary church rests in the calm of a placid and warm atmosphere. I sit in another world, and Doña Sara points the way to a thatched roof hut with walls of sticks. This is where Don Panchito lives," she whispers to me. The inside of the hut is occupied by a hammock hanging from the ceiling. Doña Sara tells me to lie down in it, and I feel the invitation as a preamble to an initiatory act. Don Panchito does not appear, and I obey Doña Sara. Several minutes pass, and a red reflection catches my attention. I turn in his direction, and a thin old man holding a cane appears in the doorway. His eyes look like two torches, and his face reflects great strength. I feel his energy in my heart, and a kind of sparkling bridge is established between us. I approach him, and he hugs me, sniffing first the left side of my face and then the right. I laugh with glee at the originality of the greeting. Don Panchito says something in Mayan that is translated to me by Doña Sara. He says that your energy is very similar to his, and that he was expecting us at in the morning, and we have arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I am astonished. The veiling is an exact but mysterious technique. Don Panchito invites me to stay lying in his hammock, and he occupies another one hanging from the ceiling. We keep silence, and little by little my mind seems to be tinged by Don Panchito's. I pay close attention, and I reach for the hammock. I pay close attention and reach an astonishing lucidity never before experienced by me. I am sure that something in Don Panchito has transferred and infected me. Suddenly a dog barks, but the sound does not come from outside or from far away, but from an area of my mind. I am able to follow, step by step, the creation of the bark, to witness its origin in a kind of unaltered and self-reflective mirror, and to follow its path in my consciousness, from level to level until it disappears like the waves of an agitated sea that has suddenly regained calm. I remember Aurobindo's description: thoughts are like birds that cross a clean sky without leaving a trace in it. I turn to see Don Panchito and realize that my search for a Mahamudra master has been rewarded. For Don Panchito, everything happens inside the mind. There is neither inside nor outside, but a continuum without space or time in which events appear. Don Panchito invites me to visit him again and stay with him for several days. As I say goodbye, Don Panchito sniffs at me, and Doña Sara translates his farewell message. He says not to worry, that he will take care of you and will continue to teach you during the dream. The return. I'm lying in a hammock inside Don Panchito's hut with him next to me, also lying in a hammock. I don't understand Mayan, and Don Panchito doesn't seem to understand Spanish. Occasionally he says something to me, and I respond with a murmur of questioning. Communication, however, exists between us, but on a plane that transcends the verbal. We have been like this for several days. My mind, as during the first visit, seems to be one with Don Panchito's and with the environment. I have become accustomed to the absence of the separation between the internal and the external, and I continue to perceive the creation of my own experience from a viewpoint that allows me to witness the origin of my perceptions, their changes and processes of interaction. My thoughts form a kind of mesh or weave that interconnects them. I can see the emergence of each one, but the strangest thing is not being able to live like this forever. Perhaps the city is to blame with its noise and distractions. Here, in this silence only interrupted by the singing of birds or the barking of dogs, everything seems to be possible. Don Panchito gets up very early, before the sun rises. He sits in his hammock in a meditative attitude, contemplating the sunrise. His cat sits at his feet, and the image of this centenarian old man, his head covered with a cap, and his cat resting under him, his hammock, the hut and the Mayan atmosphere, form a picture of such beauty and meaning that makes me feel fulfilled and blessed. At night, the whitish moonlight penetrates through the holes in the walls, and Don Panchito teaches me during my sleep to travel through universes. From Mexico City I was not able to detect it, but here I don't have to make any effort to make it happen. The universes I see are varied and very rare. Sometimes stars appear, sometimes mountainous landscapes, and occasionally submarines. The most important thing is the knowledge and observation of mental and cerebral processes. We possess an extraordinary instrument inside our head, and it is a pity that we do not know how to use it or see it. I am grateful to Don Panchito for this magnificent gift he has given me, and I would like to be able to do the same with all people. The patients. From time to time they come to consult Don Panchito. They complain to him and listen to his advice. Difficult cases require the advice of the stars. At night, Don Panchito goes out into the garden, sits on a bench, and remains absorbed contemplating the sky. The next morning, depending on the content of his dreams, he offers advice or shares the vision with his patients. The stars and his dreams seem to be the counselors of this shaman who is 90 years older than me. On other occasions, Don Panchito takes a crystal sphere out of a bag, lights a candle, and places the sphere in front of the flame and concentrates, observing the inside of the sphere. He says that the images that appear tell him what to do with his patients and speak to him of their destinies. Of the future, Don Panchito says nothing. The first time I saw him working with his spheres, I asked him to see me through them and tell me what was to come. He was shocked when I wanted to record his words. "That can't be done. Don't you realize that doing so would fix the future?" Quartz crystals. The Mayans knew about quartz crystals and their use hundreds of years before the West discovered gemotherapy. Don Panchito keeps several, but he is very careful with them. He says that they amplify everything, good and evil, and that they must be nourished so that they do not lose their power and energy. That can only be done by a trained shaman. Too bad he doesn't understand Maya. I take advantage of a visit from Doña Sara to ask questions about the quartz. Don Panchito says that the ancient Mayan priests possessed secrets. They were able to build their monuments by moving the stones at a distance with the use of their minds and the sounds they emitted. They whistled, and depending on the tonal sequence and the sharpness of the sounds, they were able to control matter and energy. The great priests gathered around large tables made entirely of crystals. Each priest impregnated a crystal with his energy, so that, in case of death, the crystal would replace him in his work while another initiate was being prepared. The work on the quartz table served to achieve a proper balance of cosmic influences. Mayan acupuncture. In the same town as Don Panchito and in the rest of the peninsula live shamans dedicated to healing and maintaining their tradition. Although none seem to have reached Don Panchito's level of consciousness, acupuncture is practiced among Maya shamans. As needles, they use the fangs of rattlesnakes or fox hairs. Through their use, they extract the damages that the patients have acquired. The Mayan acupuncturist locates the affected body area and then inserts his needles into it. For nervous disorders, the area chosen is the skull. For renal disorders, the areas of the back adjacent to these organs, etc. The use of acupuncture seems to come from a remote past, and its use is widespread. The use of fire. Don Rach Peck of Motul City is a Maya shaman, a specialist in the use of fire. When a patient asks for his help, Don Rach Peck lights a container full of kerosene and attends to the shapes of the flames that emerge from the fuel, while he palpates the patient with the help of a branch of rue. The shape of the fire speaks to him, indicating the diagnosis and the herbs he should use to cure his patients. Don Panchito knows all these techniques, but in his opinion they are not necessary. His message is that the higher the level of a shaman, the less need he has to rely on instruments. The heart. Don Panchito's message is one of love, tenderness, and affection. His way is the heart and simplicity. He does not boast of his knowledge, boast of his power, or seek honors. His life is modest, clean, and unpretentious. He almost always remains alone in contemplation and in a meditative attitude. Doña Sara found him when, upon seeing the surface of the water of a cenote, his face appeared to her, and she received a message stating that the features she saw were those of her master, whom she had to look for. For months she did so until her heart led her to Tixhualactan. Something similar happened to me when I was looking for an Indian master. My heart led me to that girl who told me about Don Panchito. However, the teaching of Don Panchito is that each one is his own teacher, and in each one all wisdom is located. The rivals. Unfortunately, Don Panchito's state of kindness and detachment is not shared by some people of power living in the Yucatecan Peninsula. In Tixhualactan itself live 3 sorcerers who envy Don Panchito and have tried to take power away from him. Don Panchito laughs at such motivations and does not worry, but takes care of his disciples by assigning them protectors. This theme is tinged with mystery and portents. A protector is an entity, life force, or psychic resultant that the shaman is able to create or invoke through a special ceremony. To Doña Sara, Don Panchito has assigned 3 protectors whose mission is to defend her from all attempts to harm her. The protégé has a great responsibility in accepting such an assignment, because his protectors have no qualms about causing terrible harm to anyone who dares to defy them. On one occasion, Doña Sara was careless and allowed 3 individuals to steal her money. 3 weeks later, one of the thieves turned up dead in her house. The other committed suicide, and the third was left an invalid. Don Panchito was infuriated by his disciples' irresponsibility and threatened to take away her protectors if she was careless again. The Elushes. The subject of power and its handling is treated with great discretion among the Maya shamans. The feats of power of the ancient Maya in their portentous capacity for mind-matter interaction, clairvoyance, understanding, and invocation of protectors is only shared with chosen disciples. The Alushas are one of these subjects of power. The shaman is able to incorporate his strength into small clay statues. These Alushas are used to defend homes, crops, or workplaces from energetic disturbances, theft, or attempted destruction. Traveling with Doña Sara, I had the opportunity to test the energy of an Alush in a small village near the coast. It was a 25-centimeter tall doll, which threw me backwards when I touched it. Direct communication. One of the characteristics common to all true shamans, regardless of their geographic location, place of origin, or lineage, is their ability to establish and maintain direct communication with their disciples, patients, and protégés. I have already mentioned one of these instances in the wake procedure. In this procedure, Doña Sara decodes the movements of the flame of a candle to know the messages coming from Don Panchito, although the latter does not need to use any other instrument than his own mind to communicate. This capacity of direct communication is a consequence of the state of unity and Mahamudra of Don Panchito's mind. The feeling when standing next to this great shaman is that, somehow, he knows who you are, what you are thinking, and what your intentions are, but above all, how far you are from your center, essence, or source. The center in the self. The true shaman can diagnose and know how far someone is from his true center, because he himself has managed to place himself there. The difficulty in describing the meaning and experience of being at the center is great because this state transcends any verbal description. The shaman recognizes the distance that lies between an individual's consciousness and his own and is powerful enough to guide him to meet it. This is the true shamanic feat, beyond energetic manipulations or clairvoyant manifestations. To bring the center to mind or to stimulate its experience constitutes the greatest miracle of the shamanic tradition in general, and of the Maya in particular. Chapter 3, The Levels of Consciousness, Part 1. An analysis of models of consciousness. The term consciousness refers to that which is at the foundation of all experience. The levels of consciousness are as many layers into which this foundation can be divided. In reality, consciousness is one and is not divided because all experience is nuanced by it. For example, auditory consciousness and visual consciousness constitute two levels of the same basic quality. We call this essential quality consciousness. And it is possible to postulate that even what we call matter possesses or is sustained by the same basis, at least at the perceptual level. Regarding the different levels of consciousness, there are schools, each of them with a particular conception. All, however, agree on the existence of basic strata, such as those mentioned above: auditory, visual, tactile consciousness, etc., and more subtle levels that each tradition denominates in different ways. In 2 chapters, I will attempt to describe 6 of these traditions, mentioning some of their considerations and the postulates that sustain them. I will first present the model proposed by Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, then the theosophical model, then the shamanic model, then the Buddhist model, then the transpersonal psychology model, and finally the synergistic model. I dare to postulate that what is common to all of them is the consideration that the layers of consciousness depend on the perception of the observer, and this on the territory with which he identifies himself. The Kabbalistic model. According to Gershom G. Scholem, in none of their systems did the Kabbalists fail to affirm the existence of interpolations between all the worlds and levels of being. Everything, according to them, is connected with everything else. From any point, infinite depths can be contemplated. According to the system of Moses Cordovero, the ascent of man to higher worlds and to the border of the void does not involve movement on his part, since where you are, there are all the worlds. According to the Kabbalah, what is located below is located above, and what is located within is located without. Kabbalah states that not only is the whole contained in each part, but it also acts upon the rest. The model postulated by Kabbalah is simultaneously longitudinal and concentric. The longitudinal approach attempts to solve the mystery of creation from a transcendent and invisible principle to its manifestation in action. This model has at least 6 levels, which are as many worlds or universes. Each universe belongs to a different dimension. At the same time, each universe is associated with a level of the soul and with a Hebrew letter. The following table, modified from a study by Aryeh Kaplan, presents the relationships that Kabbalah proposes between the levels of the soul, the universes, and the Hebrew letters. The universe of the Adam Kadmon is that of the primeval or archetypal man. The Adam Kadmon represents the human in its origin or stratum of greater abstraction. It is not, in reality, the first transcendent level, but an extraordinarily elevated manifestation of it. Above Adam Kadmon, the Kabbalah places the Ein Sof, whose translation would be the endless one intimately linked to God. The level of the soul associated with Adam Kadmon is Yechida, whose literal translation is singularity, and which constitutes the one essence, that which cannot be divided and is one. Just as from the Ein Sof comes the Adam Kadmon, from the Adam Kadmon comes Atzilut, which is the closest to the archetypal man, and which is associated with the level of soul, Chai, the living essence or the living. In Judaism, the name of God, Yehovah, is written with 4 letters, the first of which, Yud, corresponds to the Latin I, and belongs to the universe of Atzilut, or emanation, and to the level of the soul, Chai, or the living. From Atzilut arises the creation or the universe of Bariah, associated with the level of Neshama or Pneuma, and with the next letter of God's name, He, which corresponds to the Latin letter H or J, thus the singularity of Yechida, which in turn becomes the living, or J flows into Neshama or Pneuma. Until before Neshama, the levels of the soul were impersonal. Neshama associated with the universe of Bariah or creation begins to belong to a specific individual and is, so to speak, its subtlest sheath or body, its contact between the personal and the transpersonal, between the divine and the human. From Bariah arises Yetzirah, formation, i.e., that which is created in Bariah begins to acquire form in Yetzirah. This formation would seem to correspond to the first activation of a distortion of space, and the corresponding letter of God's name is the Latin Vav, or V. The corresponding soul level is the soul level. The corresponding soul level is Ruach or spirit, and could be thought of as the mechanism which in acting distorts space. Before Ruach there are no distortions. Finally, after formation there is action in the universe of Asaya, which corresponds to the last letter of God's name, He, and to the Nephesh or soul level. The 4 letters of God's name, Yud, He, Vav, He, form the Tetragrammaton and are a true algorithmic system, containing the scheme of creation from the living to its manifestation in action. Each level of consciousness is given by the identification of the observer with any of the 5 possible layers of the soul, from Nephesh or individual soul to Yechida, the primordial singularity. This Kabbalistic model is longitudinal because each level of it comes or is born from a precedent and gives rise to a consequent in a chain that begins in a singularity, which acquires life, pneuma, spirit, and finally, soul. The concentric model of the Kabbalah is known as the scheme of the Sephiroth, and 10 of them have been described, forming the tree of life. Each sephira is an attribute or quality of consciousness and constitutes an emanation from the Ein Sof. The longitudinal model is imbricated within the concentric model because each sephira manifests through a process of emanation, creation, formation, and action. This process can be experienced using Kabbalistic meditation techniques. For example, Rabbi Joseph Zayach devised a color meditation in which sustained concentration on a specific color, associated with a sephira, activates the quality of consciousness of that sephira. Another technique consists of concentrating one's attention on the Hebrew name of the sephira or its attributes until these begin to be experienced. Some Kabbalists have associated the different sephiroth with the parts of the human body. The extremes of the sephirot, Keter and Malshu, refer to two extreme levels of consciousness, Keter the highest, and Malshu its manifestation. The pattern of the sephirot is concentric because each sephira is contained within the next like the layers of an onion. However, it is also longitudinal, in the sense that there are linear connections between each layer. Moreover, each universe from Atzilut to Asaya can be divided into 10 layers corresponding to the sephirot of that universe. Kabbalah considers the existence of a luminous center linked with the Ein Sof, whose light illuminates each sephira in each universe. It will depend on the inner cleanliness of the individual, how much obstruction exists between his consciousness and the light. The less inner dirt there is, the greater the luminosity that arrives, and vice versa. An individual with an intense inner problematic will act as possessing veils of obstruction for the light. In this conception, each sephira is an emanation of the light of the Ein Sof. Most, if not all, of the practical techniques of Kabbalah are aimed at purifying the veils, so that the light will not encounter obstructions. In turn, each sephira acts and is a kind of vessel or container of an attribute of the light, coming from the Ein Sof. Each of these vessels, when filled by the light, activates an attribute or quality of the consciousness. According to the Kabbalah, the light never disappears, but the veils of obstruction can filter it so much that its luminosity may not be sufficient to fill any vessel. The Theosophical Model. Theosophy has its contemporary origin in the writings of Madame Blavatsky, who founded this current of thought that was enriched by the studies of Annie Besant and Leadbeater, among others. According to Theosophy, we possess different bodies, each of which is associated with a level of consciousness: the physical, the etheric, the astral, the mental, the spiritual, the cosmic, and the nirvanic. According to Rajneesh, not only the consciousness is different in each of the bodies, but also the quality and contents of the dreams. The consciousness will vary depending on the identification of the observer with one or another of the bodies. It is important to mention that the denomination body refers to an organization or structure belonging to a certain dimension of space. The existence of 7 bodies would also imply the existence of 7 dimensions. An experimental procedure that exemplifies the existence of structures belonging to different dimensions is cymatics. In it, 3-dimensional patterns are created when a fine powder placed on a metal plate is set to vibrate by a sound of a certain frequency. When the frequency of the sound increases sufficiently, the pattern becomes 3-dimensional. We have here 2-dimensional bodies resulting from the interaction at different frequencies between a vibrational field and a medium. One 2-dimensional body and the other 3-dimensional. The theosophical bodies would seem to be situated in this same condition of being stable structures located in different dimensions. In the same way, the Sephiroth, the Kabbalistic universes, and the levels of the soul could be understood. The first body is the physical, and its structure is organic. Its organ of thought and experience is the brain as we know it. It is limited by time and space, and is a hypercomplex and stable distortion of space. Its level of consciousness is 3-dimensional. The second body, etheric, is, according to Theosophy, more subtle than the physical, and remains invisible to it. It is capable of traveling through space, leaving, so to speak, the physical body, and its perception is more direct and subtle than that of the latter. since it does not require organic receptors to decode the information of space. The perceptual action of the etheric body could explain extraocular vision, in which trained children are able to perceive the visual world without the use of their retinal receptors. The dreams of the physical body are in causal correspondence with brain activity and can be stimulated by activating the organic receptor mechanisms. On the other hand, dreams of the etheric body correspond to etheric stimuli, also located in the structure of space. Thus, someone can dream that he flies and actually does so, because the movements of the etheric body are not bound or restricted by spatial gravitation. According to Rajneesh, the so-called spiritual visions correspond to the etheric body and are etheric dreams. The etheric body includes space within its field of action. That is to say, it frees itself from spatial restriction, and space ceases to be an obstacle to its action. Therefore, the spatial dimension in which the etheric body acts is incorporated within it, while that same dimension remains external to the physical body. The astral body incorporates, in addition to space, time. Like the etheric body, the astral body can be located in any zone of space, but it has no limit to travel to the past, even remote. The astral body, according to Rajneesh, is capable of remembering previous lives and corresponds to Jung's collective unconscious. The mental body incorporates, in addition to the temporal dimension into the past, the personal future time. It is, so to speak, in a dimension in which time and space are unified. The functioning of the mental body implies an expansion in the duration of the present, in which the past and the future are included within a perceptual unity. This same expansion is related to sensory activation, in which visual perception, for example, functions in a greater duration of the present than auditory perception. The functioning of the astral body involves the same expansion, but in a much greater order of magnitude. The mental body remains an individual body. The spiritual body, on the other hand, is transpersonal. The experiences of the spiritual body are shared by all who live it. It is a body of the species and not of a particular individual. The cosmic body is the preamble to unity consciousness. This body transcends space, time, individuality, and the conscious-unconscious dichotomy. From the perspective of the cosmic body, everything possesses consciousness. The nirvanic body cannot be described, for language no longer exists in it. It is equivalent to unity consciousness. Chapter 4, The Levels of Consciousness, Part 2. An analysis of models of consciousness. In the previous chapter, I analyzed two different models that attempt to describe and explain the different levels of consciousness. The model proposed by Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, and the Theosophical model. In this second part, I will present an analysis of 4 other models of the levels of consciousness. What is common to all these approaches to the study of the levels of consciousness is that they depend on the perception of the observer and the territory with which he or she identifies. In reality, consciousness is one and is not divided, because all experience is nuanced by it. However, the same quality of consciousness presents itself to experience and perception as constituted by different behaviors. Each school that attempts to analyze these behaviors or levels has a particular view of them. The shamanic model. The shamanic model is bifactorial. That is, it considers the existence of 2 general levels of consciousness. Some shamans call these 2 realms the visible world and the invisible world. Other shamans call them the tonal and the nawal. The visible world is equivalent to the tonal and refers to the level of everyday consciousness. On the other hand, the invisible world, or nawal, refers to a level of consciousness only accessible to seers. The Oguremes shamans of the Sierra Tarahumara speak of the coexistence of 3 spirits in each person, denoting the presence of at least 3 levels of consciousness. The invisible world for the graniceros of the state of Morelos in Mexico is populated by astral beings that defy gravity and travel through space performing works of help. The shaman can have access to this subtle realm, acquiring in this contact another level of consciousness. Some Mexican shamans are able to penetrate into mediumistic trance states, changing not only their usual personality, but manifesting a knowledge that does not belong to the level of everyday waking consciousness. The lineage of the shaman Nahual, Don Juan Matus of Sonora, has developed a whole model about consciousness and its levels. In this model, perception appears as a result of the alignment of two systems of emanations, one external to the body and the other internal. The body referred to in this model is not the organic body, but a luminous energetic body that is visible to a seer. The alignment of emanations is modulated through the action of a localization mechanism, which the Yaqui shamans call the lace point. This is located on the surface of the luminous body or cocoon, and depending on its position on it, aligns different bands of emanations, giving rise to perceptions of alternative realities. The levels of consciousness depend on the depth at which the point of embedding is located. One of the common characteristics of all authentic shamans is their capacity for direct communication, which allows them to know, without the use of verbal instruments, the state of consciousness of those who visit them. One could postulate the existence of a level of shamanic consciousness that I have called the shamanic band. The shamanic model is complex and varies from lineage to lineage. Although in all of them there are common characteristics, such as those mentioned above, and in particular, the existence of a generalized mode of shamanic consciousness. The Buddhist model. The Buddhist model is also bifactorial and is exemplified in the life of its creator approximately 2,500 years ago. The one we know as Buddha was born the son of a king. His childhood was spent isolated inside his father's palace and surrounded by all comforts. He never knew sickness, old age, or poverty. One day he decided to leave the imperial gardens, and for the first time he had contact with the people. Amazed and pained, he became aware of the existence of invalidity and grief. He abandoned his aristocratic life and for years underwent multiple teachings in order to achieve his own enlightenment. Desperate because neither asceticism nor religious practices nor control techniques helped him, he sat down under a tree to meditate, with the resolution to die or become enlightened. After several days and seeing a star, he achieved what he desired. From that moment on, he dedicated himself to teaching, and did so until the end of his days. His mind was of pristine clarity, and through hundreds of discourses given to thousands of disciples, he managed to create a whole movement of spiritual regeneration, which still inspires and guides millions of people. Buddha was a true teacher, and as such, taught everyone according to their needs and levels of understanding. His more advanced students created their own schools and lineages, trying to keep the original teaching intact and undeviating. But as Buddha imparted to each disciple an individualized method, these schools differ from each other, although they all retain the same direction. For example, there are at least 3 schools of Vipassana. All use observation as a developmental technique, but each in different areas and content. Observation of bodily sensations, observation of emotions and thoughts, observation of the environment. All 3 claim to be the repository of the original teaching of Buddha and consider the others as being far from it, when in fact they are all the original teaching. The bifactoriality of the Buddhist model is the same that Buddha lived. His 2 states of consciousness are the daily consciousness, prior to enlightenment, and enlightened consciousness. The level of everyday consciousness is that in which there is an identification with emotional, bodily contents, or mental fluctuations. The level of enlightened consciousness transcends fluctuating and temporary identifications and places the adept in a state of contact with in that state, Pleasure and pain are seen from the same perspective, and there are no mental attachments or sufferings. The enlightened human being is liberated and attains his true identity as the total reality itself. Buddha described a great number of states of consciousness, and his analysis of mental conditions and their vicissitudes have not been surpassed. Today, there are many different schools of Buddhism which use a wide repertoire of meditation techniques, but all of them can be placed within three main streams: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Hinayana considers that enlightenment is individual and depends on personal work in isolation and solitude. The Mahayana also considers that enlightenment is individual, but it cannot be attained unless everyone attains it. The Mahayana Buddhist helps others to attain enlightenment even while postponing his own. His approach is more congruent with unity consciousness and the development of universal love and understanding. Vajrayana uses the energy of the emotions as a vehicle to achieve enlightenment. One of Buddha's main discourses, the Maha-Satipatthana, exemplified. In it, the Buddha commemorates his disciples to maintain a detached observation of their bodily sensations, emotions, mental contents, and feelings, pointing out subtextually that any identification with them does not liberate, but instead their witnessing from the position of the observer leads to enlightenment. In the Sistro Sarangama, there is another indication in the same sense. Here, the existence of different strata or levels of consciousness is mentioned. Each level is lived as the ego of the preceding level and becomes the content of the consequent level when the latter is reached. In this model, the fundamental consideration is the non-existence of an absolute ego state and the idea that what makes one advance from level to level of consciousness is the inclusion of contents of experience within a process of inclusive observation. On the other hand, one of the most beloved concepts of Buddhism is that of sunyata, or emptiness. Sunyata is understood as the idea that neither objects nor the self possess absolute and independent existence. On the contrary, everything is part of an independent intermatrix of relationships. The transpersonal psychology model. Transpersonal psychology incorporates teachings from the Hindu, Buddhist, Theosophical, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mystical traditions into its body of doctrine. It is called transpersonal because it is concerned with development beyond a personal ego, and its field of study includes the transcendent states of consciousness. According to transpersonal psychology, the most natural and highest level of consciousness is that of unity consciousness, in which the differences between object and subject, observer and observed, are diluted in a unique and all-encompassing reality. Consciousness exists in everything, but the human being fragments and limits it by assigning it boundaries of separation. These boundaries are given by limiting identifications. The most common of all identities is the one associated with the ideal of the self. When a child is educated, both his parents and his school pressure him to accept the set of cultural values considered positive and reject others catalogued as negative. The appearance of negative behaviors is punished, and the manifestation of positive thoughts, ideas, and actions is rewarded. Gradually, the infant identifies with the positive aspects and represses the negative ones. If a society considers certain bodily needs to be negative, it teaches to block them even when they manifest themselves naturally. The first frontier of consciousness is thus established. When the negative aspects cross this frontier, the subject himself denies them as part of his real identity, accepting only the positive as valid and true. Thus, a personality or mask and a shadow are created. The mask is what is accepted, and the shadow is what is rejected. When the shadow is activated, the subject accuses the outside or other subjects for its appearance. In the most severe cases, the shadow manifests itself as hallucinations or delusions of persecution. The subject, unable to accept the negative aspects as part of his real identity, projects them onto the others, thus safeguarding his identity with the positive aspects. When the tension between the personality and the shadow becomes insurmountable, an identity crisis ensues, which either somatizes, causing illness and, in its extreme, death, or triggers a process of incorporation of the shadow into the mask. When the latter happens and the subject manages to accept as part of him or herself the negative that he or she previously rejected and projected to the outside, a change of consciousness occurs. In this, the subject acquires an ego which integrates the positive and negative aspects into a unity. This new identification incorporates the body and its needs as part of the real identity. A boundary of separation is diluted and consciousness expands. However, at this level of consciousness, which Ken Wilber calls the centaur, and which already includes the body and the shadow, there is still a boundary between the self and the other, or between the subject and the object. To access a new level of consciousness, the notion of body must undergo an expansion. In this expansion, events, experiences, and patterns that were previously considered as belonging to the external, i.e. the not-self, are incorporated into the self. In this way, the centaur begins to identify with his territory, and an approach to unity with others takes place. The others and oneself are no longer separated, but are lived as united in a new identity. Further on, the subject recognizes himself as a true son of man. That is to say, his consciousness is no longer that of an independent and separate person, but human in the highest sense of the word. All human emotions, all feelings and experiences that are capable of being lived as a human being are accepted as part of the identity. It is no longer so and so who experiences, but it is the human being in so and so that manifests itself. This identification with the human is a more expanded level of consciousness than the centaur consciousness, but it is still limited and with boundaries of separation. The next level of consciousness could be called cosmic when the Son of Man incorporates the cosmos as part of his real identity. Finally, the cosmic man becomes the self or pure existence, and partial designations and identities cease to exist. Unity consciousness and the Tao are thus attained. All levels of consciousness are associated with layers of identification and with fainter and fainter boundaries, until the last division is broken and one lives experiencing that which has no name as the true. At this level, it is understood that any image or perception sees itself, and that what it experiences is that, located in oneself, and finally, that and oneself eventually merge into the one. The synergistic model. Before presenting this model, it is necessary to explain several technical terms that I will use in its exposition. First of all, the term lattice. Contemporary physics considers that space has different levels of organization. The most basic level is conceived as a very complex matrix, a lattice whose structure is capable of containing an enormous amount of information. This fundamental structure is called lattice. According to lattice physics, each elementary particle is a specific modification in the lattice conformation. In the same way, an energy field could be understood as a distortion of the structure of the lattice itself. The second term I would like to explain is the neuronal field. The human brain is made up of 12,000 million small cells called neurons. Each neuron, when activated, produces a tiny change of electrical potential, activates a code of electrical signals, and stimulates the creation of an electromagnetic field. Each of these modifications of the state of the neurons are as many alterations of the lattice structure. All these distortions, in turn, interact with each other, and create a hypercomplex modification of the lattice itself. This modification is called the neuronal field. The synergistic theory states that reality is the interaction between the lattice and the neural field, and that the different levels of reality are related to the characteristics of this interaction. Another term that requires explanation is syntergia. Syntergia is a neologism that integrates the terms synthesis and energy. It refers to three physical parameters, which are coherence, informational density, and frequency. The higher these parameters, the higher the syntergia. Coherence refers to the similarity in the organization of the parts of a whole. The greater the coherence of an organization, the more similar its parts will be. Informational density refers to the amount of information that any object or medium is capable of containing. Frequency refers to the speed with which a body or an energy field oscillates. Thus, the greater the syntergia, the greater the coherence, information density, and frequency. The greatest desire of every thinker is to arrive at a conception of reality that allows him to accept its infinite diversity, but at the same time places him in the perspective. The synergistic model aims to achieve this ambitious purpose through the conceptualization of a scheme that explains the creation of perception. According to the synergistic model, consciousness is an attribute of the lattice of space-time, whose fundamental or basic state also constitutes the primordial state of consciousness, which could well be called pure consciousness. The different levels of consciousness are as many layers of the distortions that the basic structure of the lattice can assume. Human consciousness, for example, appears when the human brain manages to create a neural field that establishes a hypercomplex macro distortion in the lattice. From this point of view, a visual image, for example, is in itself a particular three-dimensional distortion of the lattice that requires, in order to be activated, a human brain and a neural field, but does not need an observer to exist. That is why S.M. Goenka, one of the most famous Vipassana masters, once stated that the image sees itself and the sound hears itself. The different qualities of consciousness and its levels are explained by the synergistic theory as being associated with discrete layers of lattice organization. These synergistic bands correspond also with discrete neurosynergistic strata of the neural field. The lattice would appear to be able to distort along a continuum without abrupt steps. The same could be considered for the neurosynergia of the neuronal field. That is, theoretically, there would not have to exist neither synergistic bands in the lattice, nor quantum levels of neurosynergic organization of the neural field. However, all the evidence described in these chapters about the existence of different levels of consciousness points out that a discrete organization must be assumed for both the lattice and the neural field. Thus, each level of consciousness would correspond to a congruent interaction between a synergetic band and a neural field, with a neurosynergetic level analogous to the synergetics of the corresponding lattice band. Just as each point of the lattice contains the totality, so each experience is an experience of the totality by the totality itself. Whether or not we understand it this way depends on our level of understanding and the identity we assume. To experience a visual image as seen by itself requires an awareness that is difficult to achieve. It is more, to arrogate to ourselves a concrete identity and consider it as the center of perception, since that is more in accordance with common sense, which presents us with separate and independent centers of existence, such as objects or organic bodies. Each sensory quality is a level of consciousness and corresponds to a particular synergic band in congruent interaction with a neuronal field of a specific neurosynergia. The latter is determined in part by the informational density of the neural field, which in turn depends on the number of neuronal interactions. This is given by the duration of brain processing. so that, associated with the neurosynergia, there is a functioning in a certain duration of the present. I had already mentioned that the expansion of the duration of the present determines a definite temporal perception, in which a series of events happening in different time are unified. Temporal unification is a transformation of space into time, and therefore can be conceived as a penetration into tetradimensionality. Thus, each level of consciousness could be conceived as functioning in the tetradimensionality or as penetrating it. Tetradimensionality possesses consciousness as an attribute, so that each sensory quality with a different duration of present and each level of consciousness also occurring in a particular duration of present could be conceived as different layers of penetration into the tetradimensional universe, until, at the limit of maximum expansion of the duration of present, what exists is the pure tetradimensionality of the lattice in pure consciousness. Chapter 5, Flowing in it without self. About the experience resulting from the temporary loss of the ego. Introduction. This chapter begins with a poem and then continues with a series of reflections that attempt to share the experiences that result from the temporary loss of self. The term "the" refers to reality with a capital letter, which Buddhism defines as the pure self, different from the ordinary reality referred to the world of objects. Therefore, flowing in the without self refers to the reality of the pure self transcending ego and object reality. Flowing in the selfless one. It is the fear of death that causes death by not living in the pure existence without structure of the one who has left everything to give himself entirely, in each instant, reborn to the mystery of the beloved. In the absence of the known, the body cries out for a repeated experience of a similar surplus, but at least a familiar one that gives presence to its authority. But when it releases the moorings to recover the faith, it realizes that the identity one real treasure is only in the intimate moment when catapult was to discard the previous mask. In the reality without me leaving behind what I thought I was, name, history, and past, the fresh life appears no longer tied, free of prison, lock and part, fills then the vision what is. The image sees itself perfection in all new nothing known except the knowledge that it is so. From miracle to miracle of the flower, the enchantment of breathing, light of movement, the whole of the sun, the infinite that is without identity, restricted without attachment to the known. The one recovers there, the one his well-beloved son, what guides it blossoms, nothing has changed, only the veil has been torn. The same light in all, but now without blockages in each one different approach to that which is. Before in oblivion for fear, sheltered in what is supposed to be. Now mortally wounded, without crutches of support, filters of obstruction, nor I in love, everything is illuminated without fear. Wisdom is the liberation of ignorance to be able to flow in him without self. Ignorance is very strange and more complex than wisdom. The latter is simple and natural. On the other hand, ignorance is labyrinthine, full of curves and dead ends. When someone does not possess wisdom, he talks and gets confused, walks among illusions that last a short time and end up submerging him in dispersion and fear. Wisdom is contact with the unnameable, with what cannot be defined or explained. It fills and does not confuse. It suffices itself in its splendor. It is self-refulgent and without end. Ignorance is madness. Wisdom is beyond madness. It includes and surpasses it. From wisdom, ignorance in its madness is glimpsed as abysmal and dark. Wisdom is human and loving. Ignorance is cruel and selfish. Wisdom is open and permanent. Ignorance is personal and hidden. Wisdom is freedom and independence. Ignorance is prison slavery and dependence. The wise is patient and humble. The ignorant is arrogant and incapable of waiting. The wise find reason to be happy with everything. The ignorant are satisfied with nothing. For the wise, nature answers and guides, but he knows himself beyond it. The ignorant despises life and its contingencies, but is incapable of transcending them. Wisdom is sweet and tender, ignorance is bitter and abrupt. To free oneself is to get out of the self, to leave it behind in order to flow in him. In this condition one heals and is healed. Wisdom appears and ignorance is diluted in its own juice. Faith is recovered, and power is regained. Everything answers, and everything is lived in fullness and mystery. Enlightened ignorance is called that blessed state in which everything is new as the vision for a newborn baby, freshness in everything and silence filled with light within. One no longer judges nor accepts to be judged. Lack of faith is the cause of depression. Questions offer no meaning and every answer is based on the absence of meaning. Instead, love is based on faith, because like faith, love is a giving oneself to the mystery by trusting in him. Flowing into him without self is faith and love. In this flowing, the self that is left behind is the personal myth, the issue of identity or identification with any limited state or condition. One flows with the knowledge and awareness that one is flowing. Nothing binds, nothing worries, nothing confines, and you are the flow and the container of it. One is equal to all and is one with all in a brotherhood full of caresses and familiarity. Judgments are abandoned, and theoretical interpretations nourish but do not limit. In the flow, in the selfless one, there is neither past nor future. The eternal present is lived without expectations or judgments. All plans, desires, and wishes are expressed now and here. All is life flowing in him. Flowing in him without self implies that he exists. If he did not exist, flowing without self would lead to chaos. He presents himself in multiple forms. Contact with him is the reference point from which experiencing contact with his manifestations becomes meaningful. In him, meaning is total. Everything makes sense and is recognized in the one reality, unique because it is not relative, unique because it is permanent, unique in that it comes from one himself. Then the trials of the unresolved begin. They arise until they are resolved. They are resolved when he recognizes himself in them. To resolve is to return to him. The same trial is not presented when it is resolved, and is repeated when it is not resolved. On this path, the power increases to the extent that one no longer moves away from him. One does not move away from him when he recognizes himself as more valuable than that which tries to turn us away from him. Growth in him consists in knowing how to remain in him. The trials of the unresolved arise from the unresolved. He does not send them as if he were separated from them. The unresolved is in you and appears when you try to complete one level. One does not move on to the next until the previous one is filled. One does not advance without retreat, but until all is resolved. Therefore, on the way to him, everything is natural and everything is as it should be. To flow in him without fear is to know that he is in everything, because the changes are always in him. To flow in him without self is total magic. Everything appears at the precise moment. There is no chance, and matter and objects come to life and intelligence. Everything answers and everything responds because he is in everything. To flow in him without me is to recover the faith of being. He is without boundaries of separation, judgments, or categories. Act and non-act become the same. Thought and silence become the same. There is no theme or memory. Everything is new and wise in its miraculous appearing and happening. One flows from one in oneself, and there is no other because all is one. Unity in him requires the abandonment of all identity. To be in him is simply to be without definitions or explanations. The strength is in faith because the secret of being is acceptance. What we experience is part of us. To live wholly is to accept that we are one and unique. If what we feel does not conform to the concept we have of ourselves, and we fight against what we experience, we lose our unity. We become divided and cease to be. By accepting everything we experience as part of our unity, we recover. But for this, faith is indispensable. Therefore, the strength is in faith, and the medicine is acceptance. Without faith, there can be no acceptance, because without faith, the fear of losing ourselves wins us over, and we prefer to keep a mask of ourselves. to show ourselves to others and to ourselves in appearance and falsehood, in the ideal of the self, and not in its reality. Faith is not in the future or in the past. It is in the present and its living. One does not have faith to wait for some future event, but to live in the present with all fullness and boldness. To have faith is to accept. By accepting, we unify ourselves, because we are no longer divided between what we are and what we should be. There we simply are, and flow in Him without the restricted and partial self with which we use to identify ourselves. To flow in Him without self is to reach the self, leaving behind the mask, the ego, the appearance. He makes a mistake who confuses himself, and instead of flowing in Him, attaches himself to the ego. He is the pure self. The ego is what it believes itself to be in appearance. It has no limits and does not depend on any identity. The ego is limited and can be defined. The definition includes the ego. On the other hand, nothing encompasses Him, because in Him is included all definition surpassing it. He is love itself, and is known by living it. He is like the light that exists only for those who can see it. He can only be known from within, although He is found in everything. There is no way to make a blind man see the light by explaining to him its correlatives or its effects. There is no definition that allows a deaf person to experience sound. Light and sound can only be known by experiencing them directly. The same is true of L. He is invisible to one who is blind to his light and deaf to his sound. But he is neither light nor sound. He has no form or color. No texture represents him, no geometry draws him, no space confines him. For Him there is no time or space, and in the livingness it happens in a timeless and spatial self. To flow it is to recognize the endless, in which sensation is without borders or termination. In it one experiences the only thing that is truly enough. Waves of endless and self-sufficient cognitions bathe the one who flows in Him. They come from no recognizable place, but they come from an inexhaustible and perpetual source. They are neither sought for nor controlled. They only appear and fill the waves of entire bliss that permeate every experience when one flows in Him without self. It is an inexhaustible sea of freshness and novelty, vital and luminous. There is no depression in Him, nor old age. He is always new, but never known. His experience guides, but it is not a path to reach a goal. In Him, the path and the goal are one. One does not flow in Him to reach Him, because to flow in Him is to be in Him. He does not exist in a future, because He is all present. He cannot be divided, because He is one without parts. To live Him is to feel Him in the utmost closeness. He occupies no place, but the place from which He is experienced is closer than one's own skin, breath or breath. He is within as the innermost, nourishing the one itself in the self. His selfhood is that of all, but of none. His existence is the archetype of existence, and His presence the mold of all presence. He is in Himself beyond any self, but sustaining all selfhood, for in Him selfhood is self-refulgent and complete. Nothing feeds or nourishes Him, but He nourishes all who flow in Him. The inspiration of goodness comes from Him, because every being is His creature and child. From Him all are loved because He is the Father of all feeling. In flowing in Him without self there is no judgment but total compassion and tenderness. No attempt is made to change or control the act, only to see them and accept them in total joy for their existence. In Him it is understood that everything arises from mystery without cause or effect. Only being in each act, entire and self-refulgent wholeness. He exists beyond any existence. In Him there is no self but being. Only without self can He be experienced. The self is a filter for Him, an obstacle for His experience, a veil for His light. But in order to remain without self, it is necessary to accept that He is also in the self, and that the self is nourished from Him. It is not possible to fight against the self in order to remain without self. The struggle against the self has the effect of strengthening the self. To remain without self is to accept Him as the origin of the self. In order to live without the self, it is necessary to love Him as the Father of the self. To abandon the self, it is first necessary to accept it. Hatred of the self is a distancing from him. The self is the seed of him and is transformed into him when it takes root. In him everything is included. Body, space, and brain. To flow in him without self is to coincide in desire between that of the self and that of him. Thus, rooted including the body, with the same desire and in action, one flows in him without self. To flow in him without me is to act in the world, but not to be of the world. The self is the subject and the myth, the reference from which one judges and perceives. To arrive at the myth of oneself is to realize that what one believed oneself to be was an illusion bequeathed by one's personal history. To surpass and transcend the personal myth is to look into the mystery of reality without the self. The self resists being discarded because in its unconsciousness it governs and determines the vision and the scene. To flow in the selfless one is to unify the seen with the one who sees. There, the external disappears separated from the internal. The subject merges with the object, and the image sees itself. To flow in the selfless one is to situate oneself in a place in which and from which life and death are glimpsed as synonyms. There is no desire other than desire. There is no attachment to any option that depends on being in the world. One could live on another planet or on no planet at all in that state. Flowing in the selfless one is the total individuality of non-individuality. One is oneself at the level where everyone is oneself, but one lives with the experience that what happens happens to oneself because it happens to the one lived in oneself. Here there are no hierarchies or divisions, no concepts or valuations. Each event is total and possesses the maximum importance, and simultaneously none. One depends on nothing, and one depends on everything. Yes and no. Presence or absence are no longer considered as absolute options. One plans and one does not plan. One decides and one does not decide. One lives and one dies simultaneously. Everything is loved because in each being the whole is glimpsed. In each act converges the totality of a perfect union of process and goal, part and whole, desire and non-desire, knowledge and ignorance. From the selfless one, what others understand by custom or habit is perceived from the freshness of an ignorance of judgment illuminated by innocence. Without self, memory is recognized as transpersonal because such is its true nature. In remembering, we do not immerse ourselves in a personal universe separated from others, but rather we resonate and tune into the collective memory and extract from it what belongs to us. To flow in him without self is to receive without obstructions or filters, to open oneself to the reality of the one mind and of the total human memory. Thought floats, and without self it registers. When the self dwells in the self, the floating thought is confused in its origin and is thought to come from the self. The mystery is in him, because every mystery is about, of the unity of which we are a part. Every unity feels itself in mystery, even if it belongs to it. To flow in him without self is to live the unity as part and as totality. Chapter 6. Mystical Thinking and Scientific Models. Levels of Identity in Kabbalah and Psychophysiology. We live in an era in which attempts to substantiate mystical experiences through different scientific models have begun to proliferate, mainly of a physical nature, but also psychophysiological. However, no true mystic would accept such a foundation, since the paradigms of science change, while the real mystical experience is, by definition and essence, based on an absolute reality that does not change and transcends any reductionist scheme. Science tries to explain the relationships between the different events manifested in the physical reality and that are capable of being measured by instruments, observed using the human perceptual capacity, while the reality to which the mystic or contemplative has access is found in a previous or transcendent realm with respect to the physical manifestation. A genuine mystic would accept, on the other hand, the possibility of establishing relations between science and mysticism, as long as these are not interpreted as reductionist attempts at the foundation of mysticism by science. With this caveat, I would like to present a series of relationships that can be established between Kabbalah and a psychophysiological model called the synergic theory, which explains perception from the reference of brain activity. The synergic theory. This theory postulates that between the information captured by the sensory receptors, the retina, for example, and the appearance of a conscious percept, a visual image, there are at least 5 energetic transformations. The first of these consists in the transduction of the energy contained in the electromagnetic waves and photons that hit the retina into electrochemical neuronal codes. These codes, in the form of binary patterns, are transmitted into the brain through 1 million channels in each optic nerve. The second transformation occurs when the cerebral cortex is activated. This neuronal mantle, made up of billions of nerve cells organized in layers, receives the binary patterns coming from the retina and the thalamus, an intermediate structure between the retina and the cortex, and activates large populations of neurons in the different cortical layers. This three-dimensional activation creates energetic fields of interaction in the cortex, which contain the information in global form. Synergic theory calls these fields together. Neuronal field. The third transformation occurs when the neuronal field interacts with the basic structure of space, the so-called lattice of spacetime. The fourth transformation occurs when the interaction between the neural field and the lattice results in a hyper-complex interference pattern. This interference pattern constitutes the energetic structure of the image. The fifth transformation occurs when, through specialized circuits, the information of the neural field activation is reduced to neuroalgorithms, which concentrate in complex logical patterns the global characteristics of the neural fields. The interference pattern resulting from the interaction between the neural field and the lattice and its neuroalgorithmization constitute the physiological correlates of the image and its interpretation. The synergic theory also postulates the existence of an observer capable of interacting with the interference pattern and witnessing its characteristics. On the other hand, the interaction between the neural field and the lattice has several associated and determining levels of perception. From the concrete perceptual experience, the image of a rock, for example, to the most transcendent levels, when unity consciousness is reached. It will depend on the degree of coherence, the frequency, and the informational density of the neural field to determine with which corresponding level of the lattice structure a congruent and interference-free interaction is established. According to the synergic theory, the congruent levels of interaction are the so-called levels of consciousness. Therefore, the synergic theory is a general model that aims to explain human perception in all its extension and modalities. The levels of language. Before analyzing some of the relationships between Kabbalah and the synergic theory, it will be interesting for the reader to note that the same levels to which I will refer in explaining Kabbalistic thought can be found in the different meanings that almost any human verbal communication is capable of assuming. I have called these different levels of meaning first, second, third, fourth, and fifth languages. See Beyond Languages, Editorial Trillas, Mexico. I will use the simple phrase, "I want an apple," to exemplify the above. In the first language, "I want an apple" has a concrete and literal meaning, without being able to deduce from it anything other than the manifestation of a simple desire. The person who communicates in the first language also does so from a literal and concrete level of consciousness. A sentence in the first language has no greater significance or depth than that which is given to it by the one who pronounces it, and should only be understood at that level. The same phrase, "I want an apple," in the second language should be understood as having a more personal, idiosyncratic, and profound meaning. The phrase is used to convey, in addition to a literal and concrete message, another one that refers to an event generally tinged by an emotion. For example, apples were the favorite fruit of a relative who is remembered through it. Thus, with "I want an apple," the following subtextual reference is being made. So-and-so liked apples just like me. Only an interlocutor familiar with the personal reference will be able to grasp the meaning of the sentence. That is, a second language communication must be understood on the same level for the communication to be adequate. In other words, those communicating must express themselves on the same level in order to understand each other. The third level of language refers to contents that are more general, universal, and deeper than the previous levels, although it includes them. "I want an apple" in third language can mean apples are a healthy food, capable of giving me health and well-being, as well as reminding me of so and so, etc. In the same way as in the first and second languages, the meaning referred to in the third language will only be faithfully understood by a listener, functioning and resonating in the same reference of meaning as the sender of the verbal communication. The fourth language is a transcendent level, in which "I want an apple" refers, for example, to bioenergetic relationships between nature and human beings, to the ecological constants of the planet, to human beings and the plant kingdom as a unit with complex exchange dynamics, etc. Here, the sender of the sentence is transmitting an implicit, sophisticated knowledge, full of biological, social, and even psychological considerations, using a simple sentence as a pretext. Establishing a communication in fourth language constitutes a symbolic platform for an exchange of knowledge and for a contact with that which transcends the concrete. The higher the level of the language, the more inclusive, powerful, and abstract the communication and its meanings will be. One could suppose the existence of a fifth language, whose level of meaning would refer to totality or unity. This fifth language would be the one involved in any communication of a true mystic, and could only be understood by a contemplative, functioning at the same level of consciousness as the former. In this case, "I want an apple" would be understood as a reference to the existence of life, or the desire to receive help from a creature by the Creator. The Kabbalistic levels. According to the Kabbalah, the human being possesses the capacity to function also on 5 different levels, namely, soul, nephesh, spirit, ruach, pneuma, neshama, living essence, chai, and singularity, yehida. Nephesh, the level of the soul, refers to the soul in its everyday state and common to every human being by the simple fact of being human. Nephesh, in extension and origin, is situated in planetary existence and could be considered as the non-physical level of the psyche associated with earthly life and the body, that which is linked to the body and identified with life in the body. The Ruach spirit possesses a territory that transcends the earthly and is more linked with the solar system as a totality. According to Yeshiel Shemer, Ruach literally corresponds to or depends on the consciousness of the solar system and constitutes a bridge of connection between the soul linked to the body and the earth. Pneuma or neshama transcends even the solar system and is linked to the consciousness of the galaxy. For a human being to function on the level of neshama, he or she must be pure enough to integrate with the galactic consciousness. Each level of Kabbalah brings man closer to God and wholeness. In Chai, essence of the living, human consciousness is the essence of life. J is beyond soul, spirit, and pneuma, although it includes them. A human being in J lives as a participant heir and possessor of the very essence of the living. He has transcended his body, his earthly possessions, the solar system, and even the galaxy, and is closer to the totality and its creator. On the fifth level, when man becomes a singularity in Yechida, the human being becomes a creator. His consciousness is that of the whole universe, and his identity is that of the totality in a perfect unity. He is the whole, and simultaneously, he is himself in a singularity without divisions or parts. The biblical dictum, "I am that I am," refers to this level of singularity. The path of development from the soul to the singularity is a return to what each human being is in reality, the creator of his experience and his world. According to the Kabbalah, each human being possesses portions of the soul, the spirit and the living essence of the many beings that comprise him, with a series of potentialities and attributes that he will have to develop and manifest before he can reach the singularity, where he returns to himself and becomes creator. In Buddhism, a similar consideration is made. There is no external creator of the universe, but each human being is a creator. This development, if it occurs, implies a purification, a detachment, and an opening to perceive more and more different levels of reality. The tendency to receive begins to reverse from the moment man reaches the level of in Nefesh. Man is not capable of giving or creating. The only thing he knows and wants is to receive. From Ruach and onwards, he begins to feel satisfied with giving, until in the singularity he manifests himself as creator and absolute giver. God does not wish to receive but to give, and the man who purifies himself is directed towards him. The levels of identity and perception. As we saw before, according to the psychophysiological model, known as the synergic theory, perception is a product of the interaction between the final resultant of brain activity, the neural field, and the information contained in space. Personal identity has as many levels as this interaction can assume. Thus, although all human beings are capable of perceiving approximately the same realities, each individual identifies with different levels of these realities. Identification with a level determines and is determined by the level of language and the understanding of the language of that level. Thus, if the identity is associated with the concrete world, the first language will be the verbal tool with which such identity will be communicated. On the other hand, if the identity is more abstract and linked with a more transcendent perception, the third or even the fourth language will be its instrument of communication. The level of the unity of the singularity of the self will require the use of the fifth language, in which each object, person, or event refers to the totality. From a logical point of view, to assume the correspondence between the singularity and the totality seems contradictory and paradoxical. But in the experience of the mystic, both extremes form a unity. Thus, the first and the fifth languages are indistinguishable from the point of view of a listener functioning in the first language. But their understanding is totally different for one who lives in Yehida consciousness and functions in the fifth language. When a human being knows he possesses an identity that includes but is not limited to his bodily existence, his personal history, his possessions, name, social position, or even his thoughts, and recognizes himself as a living being or as pure existence, his identity expands, because he incorporates in a self the global identity of the living or the existent. At this level of identity, the self is not referred to any restricted individual condition, but to the perception of oneself as existence or as life. It is not a loss of individuality, but an expansion of individuality. Both the levels of perception and identity are interrelated and connected with those of Kabbalah, as well as with the functioning of the brain. In fact, the study of brain structure is a means to understand some of the laws common to all levels. These laws could be summarized in the following points. 1. Each level includes the previous ones. 2. Each level incorporates more information than the previous ones. 3. The higher the level of identity, the more natural it is to experience it. 4. The higher levels are more interconnected with each other. 5. As identity expands, the sense of love and the feeling of equality and camaraderie increases. 6. Individuality is not lost as one ascends from level to level, but expands and strengthens. 7. The sense of selfhood and power increases from level to level. The brain as a model. The laws of identity levels can be deduced from knowledge of the functioning of the brain. It is not my intention to make here an exhaustive or technical analysis of brain functioning, but to highlight some aspects of it that are related to the identity levels and their laws. The most important of these aspects is related to the inclusion of information and its product, the neuroalgorithms. To explain the concept of neuroalgorithm, it is first necessary to know that in general, each element of a brain is connected to the rest through a very complicated network of interconnections. Thus, within this network there are components that receive information from many sources. In the human retina, for example, output neurons in the optic nerve receive information from hundreds of receptors. Circuits that concentrate information, such as those in the retina, are called convergence circuits. In such a circuit there are many levels, each of which concentrates more information than the previous ones. Any code containing concentrated information is an algorithm. A mathematical formula is an algorithm, as is deoxyribonucleic acid, the structure in charge of inheritance. Also in the seed of a tree, the latter is contained in algorithmic form. In the brain, the codes that concentrate information through convergence circuits are called neuroalgorithms. According to the synergic theory, identity levels are processed and associated with brain neuroalgorithms. The more powerful a neuroalgorithm is, the more information it will concentrate, and the more interpolations with other elements it will include. It will also contain greater power and unity, and in general, greater will be its capacity to activate the most advanced identity levels. The neural field. But obviously, the experience of identity cannot be reduced to a neuroalgorithmic functioning. The latter, together with the convergence brain circuits, constitutes the anatomical physiological foundation of language, thought, and logic, as well as being a model of the levels of identity, but not its factual reality. The latter is closer to the end product of brain activity, the so-called neural field. To understand the concept of neural field, it is necessary to consider the existence of a basic structure of space. Contemporary physics speaks of this structure, considering it as a kind of lattice or matrix in which information is inscribed. This network, lattice, or matrix, is known as lattice. According to the synergic theory, each of the activations of the neurons of the brain modifies the lattice. Since the neurons are interconnected, the totality of their interactions produces a complex alteration of the lattice, which is perceived as a visual image, a sound, and in general, as the reality we are able to experience. According to this same theory, the levels of identity are associated with the modifications of the lattice given by the neuroalgorithmic processes. The neural field is an energetic field that resonates with the lattice. This resonance has many levels of complexity, each of them giving rise to different perceptions and different identities. Rupert Sheldrake has postulated that even memory depends on the quality and characteristics of these resonances. Identity as self-perception would be the result of one of these resonances. For example, human identity would be the resultant effect of the interaction of all human neural fields in resonance with themselves and with the lattice of space. The identity of a plant will depend on the resonance that its energetic fields are able to establish with the genetic structure of its species. According to Sheldrake, the memory of oneself and the continuity of one's identity is the result of the resonance of our energy fields with our own structure. From this perspective, the identity of a mystic will depend on the capacity of his neural field to contact the energetic level associated with his state of consciousness, the possibility or not of receiving. In this way, Kabbalistic wisdom and physical and psychophysiological knowledge complement each other and constitute a unified experiential and conceptual body. This does not mean that science is the foundation of mysticism, as was mentioned at the beginning, but that both are related to each other and strengthen an understanding that pure experience does not possess. Both the Kabbalah and the Syntergic theory accept the existence of different levels of consciousness and identity. These, in the Syntergic theory, are associated with the layers of the structure of space, with which the neural field manages to create a congruent pattern of interaction. In other words, according to the Syntergic theory, experience results from the interaction between the neural field and the lattice, but that interaction is only congruent and noise-free in certain zones of interaction. These zones could be conceptualized as discrete or quantum bands or strata. Between these bands, the same interaction between the neural field and the lattice triggers an energetic process full of noise and lack of clarity or congruence. Therefore, in the intermediate layers between the bands, the experience does not appear or appears chaotic. The identity levels and qualities of perception are associated with the bands of congruent interaction. In Kabbalah, something similar is conceptualized. For example, Yitzchak Ginsberg, a Kabbalist based in Israel, maintains that Kabbalah speaks of two interacting lights as necessary to create perception. These two lights or emanations interact clearly only in certain zones or strata. When human consciousness penetrates the intermediate zones of interaction, the resulting experience is chaos. In conclusion, both the Syntergic theory and the Kabbalah hold similar views, although using different language. Both affirm the existence of different levels of identity and consciousness, attempting to substantiate them with a sophisticated conceptual tool, on the one hand, based on mystical thought and experience, and on the other, on scientific knowledge. Neither the Syntergic theory is an attempt to substantiate Kabbalah, nor can Kabbalah be judged from the point of reference of a particular scientific paradigm. Simply, both disciplines are related and seem to refer to the same existential field. Chapter 7. In Search of the Master. A Real Experience in India. In 1984, distressed by a series of personal circumstances, I decided to make a trip to India, motivated by the desire to find the peace and balance I had lost. I met a Buddhist meditation teacher, and for 3 weeks I practiced under his guidance and care the Vipassana technique at a retreat in the Rajasthan desert in northern India. In those 21 days, I kept observing my bodily sensations and my internal processes until I reached a certain degree of mastery. I could feel and witness the sensations of every part of my body, down to the smallest details. I learned to observe myself, accepting any experience without judgment or intellectual analysis. In the last days of the practice, I had dedicated myself to going through my memory. The constant observation of my bodily sensations had increased the strength of my concentration and purified me. I went through my body and, at the same time, I asked myself the most improbable questions. What had I done on the morning of October 8, 1962? Or what had I dreamt on the night of December 10, 1952, between 2 and 4 a.m.? It was enough to ask the questions for the answers to appear in my mind with an astonishing accuracy and a luxury of details that never ceased to impress me. I had no doubts about the veracity of the images I remembered, nor about their coincidence with the dates and even the times of the events. I could evoke everything from the colors, the clothes and surroundings, and even the texts of the books I was reading on this or that date. The meditation procedure had succeeded in opening all the access to my mnemonic archives, and I could verify in myself that nothing of what we live or learn, say or read is lost. Everything is there, waiting to be evoked. Memory is total. The difficulty is its recovery, but not its storage. Of course, the same memory could be evoked from different angles. For example, I could see myself as a child at school from different areas of the classroom. This meant that the archive is not linear or rigid, but functional and versatile. We do not keep stored memories as photographs, but as patterns that can be reconstructed with a certain degree of freedom. The psychoanalytic and Dianetic model, with its search for traumatic fixed memories, was wrong, and I proved it in myself. However, I was not satisfied. I wanted more, perhaps total happiness or permanent joy. Observation was teaching me, but there must be another level of existence even more transcendent than the observer. I had heard of Laxman Jew, an enlightened master, a repository of the lineage of Kashmir Shaivism. Laxman Jew lived in the northernmost part of India. I wrote to him, and he replied that he could not receive me. I had heard about Sai-Baba, who lived in southern India, near the city of Bangalore. I doubted him, but at the same time I was attracted to him. In Delhi, I learned that the train ride to Bangalore took 36 hours, and that only once a week a special train, the Bangalore Express, cut the travel time in half. However, getting a seat on the express was almost impossible and was only possible after a reservation a week or two in advance. It was night at the station, and I asked for a signal. In my mind, I spoke to Sai-Baba and told him that if it was suitable to see him to send me a sign. At that instant, the electric light in the whole station went out. I was astonished, but judged it as a coincidence. I again asked for a signal, and at that moment, the light came back on. I approached the ticket office. The express was leaving the next day. Something inside me asked me to wait in line. When it was my turn in front of the ticket counter, a man came up to cancel his ticket and it was assigned to me. It was too much synchronicity. I took the ticket and, just as I grabbed it, a woman behind me let out a terrible groan. I was frightened, but I did not return the ticket. Already on the train and 500 kilometers from my destination, I began to feel an invisible presence inside the carriage. It seemed to be someone inquiring about my life. I doubted my impression, and at that moment a child began to cry. I felt the presence and its inquiry again. I doubted 7 times that my experience was real, and the 7 doubts were accompanied by as many alterations in the wagon. A fan would suddenly turn off, something would fall, the light would go out. I stopped doubting when the events began to affect my organic body. Sudden headaches, sprains, or stings were the result of not believing in the presence I felt. I was sure it was Sai-Baba or something associated with him scanning my mind. The most painful memory of my life, my mother's illness associated with brain cancer, seemed to be the favorite event of that psychic spy that activated my memory circuits, evoking scenes from my childhood linked with my sick mother. In Bangalore, I slept in a hotel, and in the morning I went to the Sai-Baba ashram. I found his adepts waiting for him, sitting under a large awning. They were talking about the miracles of their master and praising his immense power. I had already experienced some effects of the latter, and was also waiting for his appearance. Suddenly, 2 simultaneous events caught my attention, one on my left and the other on my right. I heard someone, in the first direction, talking about what interested me most, the caves and places where the most exalted masters of India, Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi, had meditated. But what was happening to my right caught me. A boy sat passively, while his face showed a total absence of expression. But what was truly horrifying was his head, shaved and with a huge scar, surely made by a neurosurgeon. His skull existed only on the right side. On the left side, a terrifying cleft was all that was left of his left hemisphere. He practically lived with only the right half of his head. the left half being absent. I saw him in the midst of a ferocious tachycardia and could not contain a pain that shot up from my intestines and nestled in my forehead. I began to cry, remembering my mother, and practically turned away. Lost in anguish and terror, I had run out of defenses, and out of the corner of my eye I saw a late-model Rolls-Royce entering the courtyard where we were. Inside the luxurious car was Sai-Baba, who descended from the car and began to approach us. 10 seconds before he reached us, the boy on my left touched my shoulder, making me turn in his direction. He was blond, with long hair and a golden beard, and his light eyes reminded me of Christ. He said to me, "Go to Arunchala, the mountain of perpetual radiance, in the village of Tiruvannamalai. Look for Ramana Maharshi's cave and meditate in it." When he finished speaking, Sai-Baba stood next to me and made a strange gesture with his arm, as if he wanted to pick up something that surrounded my body. After that movement, he moved away and I remained motionless. I went through my interior and felt it empty. There was a kind of hollowness that used to occupy my soul, but now nothing. The sensation was that of having been robbed, raped, or sucked. I crawled away from there almost at a crawl. Meanwhile, Sai-Baba had sat on a chair and, like a conductor, was encouraging people to sing. I looked at their movements and noticed in them listlessness and boredom. For 6 days I attended this darshan with Sai-Baba. I still felt empty, and the only phrase that lingered in my mind was the one I had heard from the lips of the blonde, bearded boy. "Go to the Arunchala, to Ramana Maharshi's cave." Something, however, began to fill my emptiness. It was a strange joy that was not mine, a kind of substitute for my own self, luminous but not mine, like the effect of an exotic drug. I liked and disliked it at the same time. Other than that, I didn't feel like doing anything, thinking, talking, or even walking. Only that feeling, the thought of Arunchala, and the need to see Sai-Baba lingered inside me. On the 7th day, something told me I had to leave. The last light of my own being was about to be extinguished, replaced by another light that was not mine. I struggled all morning, and in an effort that almost made me faint, I bought a ticket to Tiruvannamalai and got on a hot and crowded truck after having rested in a park lying on the grass. The truck started off, and I, empty and thoughtless, leaned over the side, clinging to my seat. Suddenly, the feeling of emptiness changed completely, without any thought or time mediating between it and the previous state of apathy and listlessness. It was like a sudden jolt of energy. I looked for what or who had provoked it, and when I looked out the window of the truck, I saw a white Mercedes-Benz passing by with Sai-Baba inside. Once or twice a year I traveled to Bombay, and the sudden emotional and vitality change associated with his nearness stunned me. 10 seconds later, I returned to my state of emptiness and apathy. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I took a rickshaw at Tiruvannamalai. The bicycle driver pulling my small seat rode to Ramana Maharshi's ashram and deposited me at the entrance of the ashram. I practically fell faint on the stairs and tried to sleep without success. At 7 o'clock in the morning I tried to do yoga and managed 2 or 3 postures that gave me back some energy. At 10 o'clock in the morning, and after 2 hours of climbing, I arrived at Ramana Maharshi's cave. He had been meditating inside for more than 20 years. His caretaker, a slender, serene, and totally naked Hindu, except for a small loincloth, invited me to enter after offering me a vegetable fruit in the shape of a flower and with a texture and colors similar to those of the skin of tigers. I was inside the cave meditating, observing my body with my mind's eye, feeling its sensations, and after several hours I began to feel a vitality, wholeness, and joy, first weak and then more intense, filling my interior. It was no longer like a drug or a substitute for myself that inhabited me, but it was myself, whole and proper, doing it. I stayed in the ashram for 3 days in continuous meditation and walking around the mountain of perpetual radiance. The mountain and its name were synonymous. At night, that gigantic mass literally glowed as if lit from within. I felt the same way, and I promised myself never to look outside or in any human being for what I had to find inside me. On the third day I began to live in pure existence. There was no history or past in me. There was no name or profession in me. There was no country or city that was mine. The only thing that existed was existence, and me in it and as it. It was a kind of inner emptiness, but inhabited by the light of life without any owner. It was not the emptiness I had felt with Sai-Baba, occupied by another me, but the luminous emptiness of myself as an existence equal to any other existence, but at the same time unique and not shared with anyone. It was me in myself, in the absence of ego and concrete identity. I thanked God for having been able to rescue my soul, and said goodbye to Ramana Maharshi's ashram. I remember all this now as I write it, 6 years after having lived it. I learned a lot from that experience, and I share it with the hope that those who read it will also learn something from it. Chapter 8. Enlightenment in the Light of Various Spiritual Traditions. Reality and Realities. Practically all spiritual traditions agree in affirming the existence of a sublime state, which is known as enlightenment. This state comes about as a result of an establishment in reality. Since there is much confusion regarding the term reality, I will begin this chapter with an attempt to clarify it. Reality is generally considered to be what we see, the external world full of objects and living beings. Certainly no one can deny that what is presented to us by our senses is a reality, but for it to become reality, there should be no intermediary between it and us. What we perceive is the final result of a very complex process in which memories, conditioning, and interpretations intervene in its creation. The world itself, as it is filtered, as if there were a screen that colors and shades it. That screen is located inside us and is invisible to us, and therefore we are not aware of the way it acts. The mere fact of perceiving a world external to us is the product of a distortion given by the existence of that screen of perception and its filters. We begin our existence being, without recognizing ourselves neither as separate nor as united with an environment that appears as amorphous as our own body. Through an arduous process of experimentation, we recognize that there are enormous differences in the sensations that our body gives us by biting it, sucking it, damaging it, etc., with respect to the sensations produced by touching other bodies or objects. Gradually, we acquire a bodily identity that solidifies and structures itself in consciousness as a separate and independent object from the rest of the objects. Our body, in its totality, stores impressions and memorizes them on its surface and in its interior. Pleasant events are recorded and, when evoked, cause approximative and attachment reactions. Painful experiences are recorded and provoke rejection reactions. Depending on the quantity of these and others, their intensity and quality, the self and the objects of the world are tinged with the same qualities as those stored in memory. The world remains the same, but its perception will depend on the vividness and reactivity of the memories stored in our body, and thus it will be seen. By this mechanism, realities arise, which are confused with reality. The latter, in order to be perceived, would need to be perceived without intermediaries, without memories or conditioning. After the acquisition of the bodily identity, other identities arise, each of them resulting from the solidification of a set of related events. In fact, a level of self-identity appears as a result of a process very similar to that which stimulates the perception of a solid object. Both result from the identification of a pattern and the activation of a cerebral neuroalgorithm. The latter represents the structure derived from the set of related events. The object is indeed a process, but it is perceived as a solid object as a result of its algorithmization. The solidification and the perception of separateness and independence are the perceptions of the internal algorithm and not of the external object. The latter is a bundle of atomic and molecular motions interrelated with each other and with all energy fields existing in space. Identity, at any of its levels, is also a process of interrelated events that solidify to the internal perception and acquire separateness and independence. Subsequent levels of identity, starting from the bodily, result from a scheme of internalization of norms, values, prohibitions, and social frames. Certain spontaneous responses of a child are rewarded and others punished. The parent's point of view, their own identity reference, is bequeathed to the infant and, little by little, determines in him/her a similar identity to the one considered adequate. It will depend on the development of his mentors, on the conscience of his parents and relatives, the expansion of the child's identity. I do not have enough space to explain in detail the possible levels of identity that can be internalized, but suffice it to say that in all of them there is a boundary of separation between what is believed to be and what belongs to not being. The surface of separation between these two beliefs is the frontier of personal identity. The reality of the self is confused with the reality of what one believes oneself to be, in the same way that the reality of the world is confused with the reality of the perception of the world. The truth is that there is a reality in which there is no separation between what one is and the world. The experience of this reality is enlightenment. The structure of reality and its experience. A good model of reality and its structure is derived from the analysis of the organization of space. In space, each of its points concentrates information about the totality. Everything that happens in the universe is reflected in changes that occur in any and all of its portions. The organization of information in space is holographic, not only for the above reason, but for the fact that everything in it is interconnected and nothing in it is independent. On the contrary, a structure of mutual interdependence, non-separativity, and mutual interconnectedness forms the spatial fabric in which all knowledge is inscribed. What is happening in this place has repercussions and affects all the zones of space, and what happens in all the points of the universe is represented here. Our brain registers all these changes, however subtle they may be, but our consciousness only detects those that stand out above the noise of the system. In turn, the system noise is determined by the unprocessed memories that exist in the body, by the filters of reality and its mediating screens. If this noise were diminished, we would be aware of what is going on throughout the universe because we naturally register it. The structure of reality is entirely similar to the structure of space. Each level of ego identity contains the seed of reality. From the indefinable sense of being in the neonate, the experience associated with bodily identity in the infant, and all subsequent levels of identity, reality is present, but limited by some solidified structure. In other words, what I feel to be as myself contains the experience of reality, and this is found throughout the scale of my development up to enlightenment itself. The difference is that in the latter, my identity is reality itself without filters or separations, whereas before, reality itself was experienced as a self, but in a limited and distorted form. The taste of enlightenment. Since reality is holographic, its flavor is found in each of the layers of the self. The self from which we observe the world is the same self from which the world observes itself. To experience the fact that the image sees itself and the sound hears itself is to place oneself in the reality of enlightenment, and there the flavor of it is full complete. In all other identities, the experience of self also contains the taste of enlightenment, but to a lesser degree and with a mistaken cognition. The understanding that there is no observer independent of the observed, and that there is something beyond any dichotomy, is only achieved when all solidifications of all identities have been discarded. This, in turn, comes about as a result of the clearing and elaboration of memory and the consequent perception of nothing as an independent object with absolute existence. In reality, nothing exists except itself, because the solidity of everything has disappeared. This disappearance occurs when it is clearly perceived that the solidification was only an adaptive and necessary mechanism to avoid being interned in a Western psychiatric hospital. Identity without solidification is the identity of a self without separations. Matter and consciousness. One of the most difficult cognitive legacies to discard is that which affirms the existence of matter. The basic structure of space is considered as inanimate, although it is assigned the capacity to create all possible forms. The latter, as distortions of an inanimate structure, are also categorized as inanimate. Far removed from our conceptions is the primary idea that even the very structure of space is consciousness. If we were to assume this consideration, we would have to accept that all that exists are different levels of complexity of the same consciousness. From this point of view, human existence and that of an elementary particle share the same substrate. Also, from this point of view, such a reckless statement as "the image sees itself" acquires full meaning. If this is so, the focal points of identity are superfluous, and the sensation of possessing ego independence is nothing more than an illusion derived from the process of solidification. According to this, I am the one who perceives a reality separate from me, and if I were to cease to exist, the perceived reality would also cease to exist. The truth is that I can never cease to exist, simply because I have never existed and never will exist. The illusion of separate existence falls to pieces in the reality of enlightenment, for there it is realized that there never was birth and there never will be death. Let us now hear what the enlightened ones of the different traditions have said about their experience of reality. In enlightenment, individuality is not lost, but is expanded, and each realized being enriches reality. At the same time, from reading what follows, it will be more than obvious that the experience of reality is one and does not differ from tradition to tradition. The experience of enlightenment in different spiritual traditions. Zen Buddhism. Zen, as we know it today, originated in China when Bodhidharma, the 280th patriarch from the Buddha of our age, introduced Buddhism to China from India. Zen did not exist in India because the Hindu spirit, unlike the Chinese, is too metaphysical and far removed from practical life. However, it is believed that Zen appeared one Hindu evening when Buddha was preaching before a congregation of his disciples on the Mount of the Holy Vulture. He did not speak because he wished to transmit directly the doctrine of enlightenment, which cannot be explained in words. He simply held up a bouquet of flowers before the assembly, a bouquet that someone had offered him. No one understood the message except Mahakasyapa, an old and noble disciple who smiled silently. The Buddha understood that Mahakasyapa was able to grasp the full meaning of enlightenment and proclaimed, "I have the most precious treasure, spiritual and transcendental, which at this instant I hand over to you, O Venerable Mahakasyapa." Mahakasyapa was the second patriarch, after Sakamuni himself, and the only one who grasped the doctrine of enlightenment. Buddha knew that his realization integra would not be understood, and never attempted to explain it fully. He developed a series of moral and doctrinal precepts that are often confused with true Buddhism. Forgetting that Buddhism is rooted in the experience of enlightenment directly, Zen prides itself on being the only branch of Buddhism that is capable of stimulating enlightenment and is based on it as the essence of its teaching. Of the Buddha who preceded Sakamuni we remember, Pure and immaculate is the nature of all sentient beings. From the very beginning there is neither birth nor death. This body, this mind, are phantasmal creation, and in phantasmal transformation there is neither sin nor merit. This body, this mind, our phantasmal creation seems to refer to the illusory solidification of processes, to the confusion that sees absolute existences in what is neither absolute nor independent. The sixth patriarch from the Buddha of this age said, "Penetrate into the ultimate truth of mind, and you will have neither things nor non-things. Enlightened and unenlightened are the same. There is no mind and no thing." To penetrate into the ultimate truth of mind is to reach the real nature of the self. There are no reified structures. There is nothing except reality. In reality, it is understood that everything is enlightened, and that the enlightened and the unenlightened are the same. Everything in Zen is paradoxical to the logical mind, but in enlightenment, the paradox ceases to be paradoxical, because communion is established with the only thing that really exists and is not illusory. About my own actualization these days, it is truly creative and destructive. I play with miraculous transformations, penetrating all circumstances, and wherever I find myself, I have nothing more to look for. Circumstances are no longer able to change me. If students come looking for me, I go out to see them. They do not see me. Thus I dress in all kinds of garments. The students immediately begin to speculate about them, taking them as my words. All this is very sad. Blind, shaven, eyeless men depend on the garments I wear, green, yellow, red, or plain. When I take them off and put on only the garments of purity, the students see a reflection and gather among them with joy. And when I undress, they are disappointed, and with surprise they run scared and complain about my nakedness. So I say to them, "Do you truly know me, who is clothed in all these garments?" And suddenly they turn their faces and recognize me. Rinzai Gigan. Once a great scholar came to talk to a Zen master, and the Zen master invited him to tea. He began to pour the liquid into a cup until it was full, but continued pouring it. The scholar, astonished, shouted to him, "Can't you see that it is already full and overflowing?" "That's right," said the master. "There's no more room for it. It is like your mind, too full for anything to fit inside. To understand Zen, you must first empty yourself. The content of enlightenment cannot be predicted from intellectual analysis. In Zen, a transcendence from linear logic must first occur in order to access enlightenment." Judaism. In Judaism, God cannot be represented in any known form. He has no color, no shape, no texture. He is neither a voice nor an image, and any rational concept of his existence is incapable of explaining him. God is total illumination, without time or space, and the man who wants to be enlightened must approach his magnificence, wanting nothing for himself. The Jewish Kabbalah is an attempt to understand the divine laws, a true science of ecstasy that transfers to a human language the experiences of the great Jewish mystics in their attempts to approach God. Jewish Hasidism is the experience of enlightenment in life. It is characterized by the rejoicing and the joy of living, understanding that God is in everything, and that the mission of man on earth is to rescue the consciousness of all matter. Hasidism had its origin in Israel. Baal Shem Tov, who was born in Poland and liked to isolate himself in a forest to meditate in it for weeks on end, dialoguing with God in the solitude of nature. The Baal Shem Tov, Besht, opposed the rabbinical movement of his time, too rationalistic and elitist. Millions of Jews saw in it the liberation from an arid and sad intellectualism, and the possibility of speaking directly with God without the need to resort to any established authority. From the Besht, the Hasidim explored ways to achieve enlightenment, emphasizing the need to reach humility and the absence of ego. The successor to the Besht said, "But to penetrate the universe of thought where everything is the same, you must abandon your ego and forget all your problems. You cannot reach this level if you are attached to physical and worldly things. for then you are bound to the division between the good and the evil, that which is included in the 7 days of creation. How then can you approach a state beyond time in which absolute unity reigns? Moreover, if you consider yourself as something and ask to satisfy your own needs, then God cannot clothe himself in you. God is infinite, and no vessel can contain him in any way, except when a person makes himself as nothing. In Judaism, oneness is valued above all things, and God is conceived as one and only one in whom everything is included. The Creator is in himself the known, the knower, and the knowledge. His knowledge does not consist in the fact that he directs his thoughts to objects external to himself, since in understanding and knowing himself, he understands and knows all that exists. In this way, the perfection of all creatures consists in the support that unites them with the primary origin of his existence, and they fall and sink from that high and perfect position in proportion to their separation from him. For Judaism, enlightenment consists in approaching him, that is, in reaching the unity in which the observer and the observed, the subject and the object disappear, and the image sees itself. Hinduism. In the Aphorisms on Yoga by Patanjali, this compiler described a technique that allows to obtain direct knowledge with respect to any object. This technique is called samyama and consists of 3 steps. Suppose we wish to know a flower. The first step of samyama on the flower consists of attending to the flower by concentrating on it. The second step of samyama consists of keeping the concentration totally focused on the object. When this is achieved, the flower ends up occupying totally the consciousness of the practitioner, without any other content but it. Finally, the third step is penetrated when a fusion with the flower is achieved and the flower is understood from within, knowing its meaning. At that moment, the flower disappears as a solid and codified object. This samadhi in Patanjali's system, when applied to the self, results in enlightenment. In the same way, doing samyama on reality transforms it into reality. Hindu thought speaks of the existence of a fundamental or essential level that is accessed when the fluctuations of the mind are inhibited. In the words of Patanjali, yoga is to prevent by control the substance or fundamental element that constitutes the mind, chitta, from taking various forms, riddhis. During that time, the time of concentration, the observer, purusha, rests in his own state. His own state is his basic and natural condition, in contact with himself without obstructing filters. I am this refers only to the pleasure of being, that presence in the I am ... If you trust me, believe me when I tell you that you are the pure vision that illuminates the consciousness and its infinite content. Realize that and live accordingly. If you believe in me, then go within yourself asking, "What am I?" or focus your consciousness on the I am, which is pure and simple. Discover all that you are not: body, feelings, thoughts, ideas, time, space, being, and non-being. This or that, nothing concrete or abstract that you can point to is you. You must observe yourself continuously, particularly your mind, moment by moment, without neglecting anything. This witnessing is essential to achieve the separation of being and non-being. When the person and the observer see each other as one and go beyond each other, one is in the supreme state. This is not perceptible because it is that which makes perception possible. It transcends being and non-being. It is neither the mirror nor the mirror image. It is what it is, the timeless reality, incredibly clear and strong. Observation would seem to be one of the most valuable methods of achieving enlightenment, but enlightenment is achieved when one goes beyond the observer. The observer is one and all that is observed. It integrates and unifies the witnessing self, but awareness is only a technique, because in unity there can be no difference between the observer and the observed. Taoism. The Tao that can be expressed in words is not the true Tao. With this consideration, Lao Tse put on notice those who tried to explain his system using verbal logic. The Tao is that which cannot be expressed but only lived. It is always to be found everywhere. It does not exist when its presence is ignored, because it is always there for those who awaken to reality. For years, Fan, born in Ping, searched for the Tao. For this, he isolated himself in the solitude of the mountains around Mount Omei. One morning, Fan laughed out loud. "Ha ha 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 ha, why didn't you tell me earlier? I have not found the Tao, but suddenly realized that I had never lost it. Those crimson clouds at dawn, that bright light at noon, the course of the seasons, the melting and evaporating of the moon, all these are not majestic functions or auspicious symbols of what lies behind. They are the Tao. To be born, to breathe, to eat, to reread, to walk, to sit, to wake, to sleep, to live, to die. To do all that is to follow the Tao. When you learn to take things as they come, without preoccupying yourself with thoughts of joy and sorrow, letting yourself go without thinking of the desire for something to be other than what it is, then you are one with the mists of the valley, the floating clouds. You have attained the Tao. You have been reborn immortal. It is a joke to spend years searching for what was never lost." Quoted by John Blofeld in Taoism, Martinez Roca, Spain, 1981. Again, we find unity as the supreme state, synonymous with enlightenment. This perception will bring you face to face with the authentic secret dear to all accomplished sages. The mind of the one who returns to the source becomes, with it, the source. Your own mind is destined to become the universe itself. Christianity. Jesus' 40 days of fasting and his rejection of material goods and worldly powers indicate that his identity was tied neither to his body nor to its satisfiers. The way in which he handled his bodily pain while retaining love for his fellow man indicates that his consciousness was situated in reality. He was free from established authority, thus demonstrating his detachment from collective identity. Being established in reality, all the references he made to himself were not personal, but referred to the state of realization and consciousness he had managed to attain. This is the only way to understand some of his statements. "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and follow me." Luke chapter 9:23. That is to say, if someone wants to approach enlightenment, he must de-identify himself with respect to his limited identity. In unity consciousness, bodily limits include the environment. Hence, feats of power can be performed. The miracles attributed to Jesus can be explained as a result of his being established in his real nature, which is the same for everyone and everything. In reality, what one lives is not separate from what others live. One is the Son of Man because all human possibilities are included within one's own identity. "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me." Luke chapter 9:48. "In my name" means in my state of consciousness, in which the child and I are one and the same. Disidentification implies innocence and non-judgment, perception of the obvious and spontaneity. There is no ego and no preconceptions. One is like a child. "I praise thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes." Luke chapter 10:21. The wise and learned are those who use linear and rational logic, and reality can never be appreciated in this way. Reality is found in everything, and everything transpires its beauty and magnificence. "Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. But I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." Luke chapter 12:27. In reality, there is no chance, and everything is as it should be. But to perceive this, one must live in the present. The kingdom of God will not come with warning, nor will they say, "Behold, the kingdom of God is among us." Luke chapter 17:20 and 21. Mexican shamanism. Omniscience is one of the most appreciated qualities in Mexican shamanism. Don Panchito, from Tixhualactan, possessed it to an extraordinary degree. Everything that happened took place inside his mind, and he observed. The appearance of a sound was perceived by him, step by step, and nothing existed on the outside. The bark of a dog was constructed in one zone of his mind and became nuanced in another until it became recognizable. But neither dog nor bark existed in an outside separate from his own mind. Since everything happened inside, there were no distances for his consciousness. He knew what his disciples did, said and experienced as if it were happening to him. The surgical feats of Pachita, in which the materialization of organs and their transplants were part of her daily life, cannot be explained unless we consider that this Nawala shaman was located in the unity, and that her body embraced that of her patients. In the organic body, a command to move an arm is followed by the act in a natural concatenation. When the body expands, things obey the orders because they have ceased to be things and become parts of the body itself. For Don Juan Matus, perception is explained as the result of the alignment of two bands of conscious emanations, commanded by an interlocking point. Enlightenment occurs when the shaman is able to simultaneously align all the bands, maintaining the consciousness of being during this expansion. Aligning all the bands implies reaching the unity of all possible realities. Don Rodolfo, from Jalapa, affirms that the true shaman is the one who has managed to love everyone as he loves himself, making no distinction in his work of helping and healing others. Don Lucio, from Morelos, was able to establish contact with a level of reality in which all are brothers, in the absence of jealousy, envy, or competition. From his experience, everyone in need of his help receives it, even if it means a personal sacrifice. The shaman is open to experience non-ordinary levels of reality and serve as a bridge between them and everyday reality. Therefore, he is an expert in penetrating states of ecstasy from which he draws his wisdom. Sufism. The mystics of Islam are in love with love. They consider that the heart is the center of living, and from there, in love for everything, one can live reality. The seeker is the meditation technique used by the Sufis. In it, the following affirmation is made: Allah il-aha il-Allahu. There is no God except God. God is reality, and nothing exists outside of him. The Sufi loves God above all things, and through that love achieves unification. His love entered and removed everything except him, and left no trace of anything else. In this way, he became one just as he is one. The longing of the Sufi is to draw near to God, the Beloved, and to be one with him. To feel united with God for an instant is better than all human acts of devotion from the beginning to the end of the world. Rumi proclaimed that the love of the soul for God is the love of God for the soul, and that in loving the soul, God loves himself. In my heart thou dwellest, in my eye you shine, just to be one with you. My soul desires. Conclusions. Reality is one, as is enlightenment, and although each spiritual tradition refers to the supreme state using different terminology, mind in Buddhism, God in Judaism, Tao in Taoism, they all speak of the same thing. In enlightenment, individuality is not lost, but expands. Each being who has attained enlightenment remains himself, and reality manifests in him in a form of his own, enriching it with his own being. Enlightenment is not an emptiness void of content, but it is required to reach the emptiness of all filtering and conditioning to live it. In it, love and compassion permeate every act. Enlightenment does not imply an abandonment of life or the body. On the contrary, reality is effervescent and pure life, full of experiences and contents. In enlightenment, one is in the world, but one is not of the world. One is there to share and collaborate, because in enlightenment, the only motivation with respect to others is to help them to reach it. May we all become enlightened in this life and reach reality. The Buddhist doctrine of emptiness in the light of contemporary psychophysiology. For the Buddhist, the understanding of emptiness is an indispensable requisite for the attainment of enlightenment. Enlightenment occurs when the seeker contacts reality as it is and recognizes its true nature. The doctrine of emptiness affirms that nothing exists absolutely, independently, and permanently, and that the difficulty in freeing oneself from the bonds of conditioned life consists in ignorance of reality and its confusion with the illusion we have about it. In other words, in perceiving, we see the world as made up of objects that seem to be separate from each other and independent of each other. When we see ourselves, we do so in a similar way. We consider that we possess a self with an independent, permanent, and absolute existence. Just as we reify objects, we solidify ourselves, and this misperception is the cause of our remaining in a state of unfreedom and absence of wisdom. On the other hand, if we would recognize that both objects and ourself appear as absolutes because that is how we perceive them, but not because they are, we would free ourselves from the veils and errors of perception of both the environment and ourselves. Emptiness refers to the absence of filters of perception, which allows us to see reality as it is. Reality is that everything is interdependent, changes from moment to moment, and nothing has absolute existence. From the point of view of reality, there is nothing to be attached to, and therefore nothing that can cause suffering. The latter occurs as a consequence of our attachments, and these occur as a result of the consideration of loss. We suffer when we feel that our self is in danger of being damaged or destroyed, because we consider that our self has inherent existence and is subject to death. The absence of suffering results from the absence of attachment, and this is a consequence of non-existence. In other words, by recognizing that our self has no absolute existence, there is no fear of losing it, since what does not exist is not susceptible to being lost. The doctrine of emptiness brings as a consequence liberation, precisely because of the reason above. Knowing that everything is void of absolute existence, that everything changes, and that everything is interdependent, there can be no attachment, no fear of destruction, and no death, since that which has never been born cannot die. If the doctrine of emptiness is true, our psychophysiological functioning must be congruent with it. In this chapter, I will review contemporary psychophysiological knowledge in order to analyze the extent to which what we know about the psychophysiology of perception supports or contradicts the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness. The structure of space. In order to understand the psychophysiology of perception, it is necessary to analyze the way in which information is organized in space. Therefore, I will begin my argument with a description of the structure of space. From the point of view of modern physics, what we call space has different degrees of organization, from a level of empty space to a space full of objects. The basic or fundamental level of space is a colossally complex matrix of total coherence and symmetry. This matrix is a kind of lattice in which each of its points concentrates the information of the rest. In such a space, there are neither objects nor particles. Time does not pass, and there is an absence of gravitational forces. This level of space is called the lattice of space-time. A next level of space involves a distortion of the lattice. When this occurs, an area of the lattice loses coherence and undergoes a microcurvature. A physical instrument detects this distortion as an elementary particle. There are families of similar distortions and therefore defined categories of particles. What we call a material object is an interrelated set of microdistortions of the lattice. The level of the organization of the object-filled space is a level at which the lattice is distorted in all its portions. The term distortion is not pejorative, but only descriptive and should be interpreted as such. The lattice is a kind of superconductor in which any of its distortions is represented in each and every one of its points. The level of the lattice, in the absence of distortions, is an abstraction, but a space that approaches it is the interstellar space, far from any object. In that space, the lattice approaches its level of maximum coherence and symmetry. Let us call this pole of the spatial organization the pole of high syntergia. On the other hand, the pole of space organization in which the lattice is distorted and material objects exist, has minimum coherence and low symmetry. Let us call this pole of low syntergia. The higher the syntergia, the higher the coherence and symmetry. The lower the syntergia, time does not pass, there are no material objects and no gravitational forces, while in a low syntergia space there is matter. Time runs and there are gravitational forces. The brain analysis of the lattice. When our retinal receptors interact with the information located in space, they transform the distortions of the lattice into neuroelectrical signals that are encoded in the form of patterns. It will depend on the characteristics of the distortions, the type of patterns that are triggered. These patterns are true algorithmic formulas which penetrate the brain through millions of nerve channels. Inside the brain, and especially in the cerebral cortex, these patterns are concentrated by convergence circuits. The human retina is a good example of a convergence structure. The first retinal layer is composed of several 100 million receptors, while the last layer of the retina has only 1 million neurons. The information from several hundred receptors is concentrated in one fiber, and a neuroelectrical pattern appears in this fiber, which is a high-powered algorithm. In other words, the retinal circuit structure is convergent, and each output fiber of this structure concentrates information from a large population, several hundred of receptors. The output algorithmic pattern contains, in a logical structure, the concentrated information that, prior to its activation, was scattered. In the cerebral cortex, the processes of informational concentration and neuroalgorithmization increase their power, so that a small population of nerve cells concentrates in a neuroalgorithmic pattern the information of billions of neurons. By means of this functional procedure, information is unified. The perception of objects. When a distorted area of the lattice is encoded by the brain, it activates neuroalgorithmic patterns, which concentrate information in its structure and unify it. We see an object as a solid, independent, and separate from the others, because what we really perceive is the unified internal neuroalgorithm, and not the distortion of the lattice. In the process of neuroalgorithmization, not only the information coming from the lattice distortions, but also our memories and past experiences intervene. In other words, every neuroalgorithm is a mixture of the information coming from the lattice, added to the internal information. When we see an object, we see in it all this information concentrated and mixed. From this point of view, the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness is totally congruent with the psychophysiological way in which perception functions. Only a neuroalgorithmic functioning free of memories and additions would give us the vision of reality as it is. An object appears as a solid because, in our perception, we transform the neuroalgorithmic unit into a solid thing. The neuroalgorithmization of the self. Exactly the same thing happens with the perception of ourselves. It can be conjectured that, as with the neuroalgorithmic unification of an object, in which millions of cellular activations are concentrated in a convergent pattern, the self arises from a unified concentration of all the information of the brain. In other words, one can assume the existence of a final neuroalgorithm, which represents the activity of the whole brain system and concentrates it into an algorithmic pattern of very high power. This neuroalgorithmic unification would be perceived as the self, with all the characteristics of independence, separateness, and absoluteness that we assign to any material object. In that way, the self is also perceived as an unchangeable and absolute thing. The neuroalgorithm of maximum power concentrates in its logical structure the information of the whole system with all its memories, conditionings, traumas, and associations of the past. The liberation. From the Buddhist point of view, Liberation occurs when we manage to discover that egoic solidity and objectual solidity is false. That is to say, that there is no absolute and unchangeable self, just as there are no objects with absolute existence. This liberation occurs when memories are purified and reality is not confused with a distorted interpretation of it. From the psychophysiological point of view, the above process occurs when the convergent chains responsible for neuroalgorithmization are purified and the neuroalgorithmic solidity is dismembered. In this condition, the absolute and fixed, solid character of self and objects disappears, and in its place reality appears as it is, a continuous and changing flow in which erroneous interpretations cease to exist. When this happens, the coherence of the brain system increases, as does its symmetry. This is equivalent to a space of high synterchia. On the other hand, when there is neuroalgorithmic fixity, there is no fluidity and everything is perceived as reified. This is equivalent to a space of low synterchia. The neuronal field. Each of the activations of the neurons of the brain evokes a micro-distortion of the lattice of space. The ensemble of all these micro-distortions activates a hypercomplex macro-distortion of the lattice. Contemporary psychophysiology calls this macro-distortion the neuronal field. The self, therefore, is perceived as this mixed and unified whole. The neural field in interaction with the lattice is perceived as the world. When the brain activity is of low synterchia, the resulting neural field also possesses a low synterchia structure. A neural field of low synterchia is only capable of establishing a congruent interaction with a level of the lattice also of low synterchia. The world resulting from such interaction is a concrete world, full of objects and reified. On the other hand, a neural field of high synterchia is able to interact in a congruent way with a level of the lattice of high synterchia. The result of such interaction is a more subtle and abstract perception of the world in which everything flows and there is no solidity. When a neural field possesses the highest possible synterchia and interacts with the basic level of the lattice, the resulting experience is enlightenment. Conclusions. The Buddhist doctrine of emptiness is totally congruent with the psychophysiological functioning. When the neuroalgorithmic circuits are purified and a neural field of high synterchia is activated, the perception is of reality as it is. The solidity, independence, and absolute character of objects and the self disappear in reality to give way to a fluid, free, and unbound vision. An object is perceived as a solid when it is neuroalgorithmized. What is perceived is the internal neuroalgorithm and not the external object. Since the neuroalgorithm is saturated with memories, the world is interpreted according to them and is not seen as it is, that is, always new, changing and fluid. The same is true of the self. According to Buddhism, reality is numinous, effulgent, all shining, and in it we are situated when we achieve the emptiness of all intermediary perception. According to psychophysiology, the lattice in its pure state is coherent, symmetrical, numinous, effulgent, and contains all the potential energy of all manifestation. We are in it when the neural field reaches levels of high synterchia, and these are only achieved when the neuroalgorithmic fixity ceases. Both approaches, the mystical and the scientific, speak of the same thing and reach similar conclusions. As for the practice that allows to achieve emptiness and high synterchia, this is either meditation in which the egoic identity patterns are identified, observed, and transcended, or the feedback of interhemispheric coherence, in which a subject learns to increase his cortical synterchia. The first technique comes from the classical Buddhist tradition, and the second from contemporary electrophysiological psychophysiology. Chapter 10. The Electrophysiological Foundations of the GAIA Hypothesis. The GAIA brain. The GAIA hypothesis, according to which the planet Earth is a living and conscious organism, requires an experimental foundation. To accept GAIA as a fact, it is necessary to demonstrate that, like other organisms, its structure is made up of interconnected cellular units, forming an organized and non-amorphous fabric, and that this structure is divided into strata capable of performing specific functions with a defined hierarchy. If we take the human body as an example, it is constituted by a huge set of interconnected cells, forming tissues and organs, which perform specific functions within an organized and mutually dependent hierarchy. The brain of the human body, and with it the entire nervous system, occupy the first hierarchical level. Since they act as controllers of the rest of the systems, no organic system is capable of surviving in isolation and disconnected from the others, and the health of the whole organism depends on the balance between its constituent parts. GAIA as an organism must comply with this minimum of organizational rules to be accepted as such, rules that identify it as a global system similar, though not necessarily identical, to any other living body. There is an evolutionary scale of complexity among living organisms. The functions that a mosquito can perform are definitely less than those that organisms such as an elephant or the human being itself are capable of manifesting. The functional complexity of an organism depends, among other things, on the number of elements that form it and its organization. Organic brains manifest the same correlation between their functional complexity and the number of neurons that constitute them. GAIA, as an organism, must have a brain and a nervous system supported by a nutritional and energetic support structure. The brain of GAIA must be formed by hyperneurons, interconnected among themselves, and giving rise to emerging functions more complex than those manifested by each one separately. In the same way that the human brain manifests complex functions given by the interconnection of all its individual neurons, each neuron in the human brain contains all the information of the unit to which it belongs. But a single neuron is not capable of manifesting the functions of the brain unit. In the same way, the brain of GAIA must be made up of individual hyperneurons, capable of containing all the information of the unit to which they belong, but incapable of exercising the functions of the latter. I propose that the units of the GAIA brain are each of the human brains that inhabit planet Earth. These hyperneurons, if the previous hypothesis is true, must be interconnected among themselves, and in addition, they must be able to contain all the information of the unit to which they belong. In this chapter, experimental evidence is presented that leaves no room for doubt about two facts. A. There are direct interactions between human brains. B. The human brain is capable of detecting subtle events at a distance and directly. This evidence was obtained in one of the psychophysiology laboratories of the Faculty of Psychology of the National Autonomous University of Mexico by the author of this article and by a group of researchers, including Manuel de la Flor and M.E. Sanchez Arellano, and supports the GAIA hypothesis at the experimental level. Before presenting this electrophysiological evidence, I would like to introduce it with the following reflections. The great mystics and enlightened ones of all times have affirmed that there exists a level of consciousness in which the separations between subjects and between subjects and objects disappear. This state is called unity consciousness, and is characterized by the fact that the person who experiences it expands his identity and gets in contact with a transcendent level of himself, which goes from the planetary consciousness to the great mind, the self or the pure self. In Buddhism, for example, it is recognized that upon reaching the enlightenment of the Buddha state, in addition to the disappearance of the object-subject dichotomy, omniscience appears, during which all events occurring on planet Earth and even in the entire universe are perceived in the consciousness of the one who has attained Buddhahood. These experiences suggest the existence of a global brain with which one can interact and which manifests more complex functions and a greater knowledge than any of its elements. Whether this brain is Gaia or even a more unified organism, of which the brain of Gaia constitutes an element, cannot be assured, but subjective evidence indicates that it not only exists, but that the human brain possesses the capacity to access it. The state of omniscience requires, as an indispensable condition, two conditions. 1. That the human brain naturally is capable of registering any event in the universe in a direct way. 2. That the subject possessing such an instrument of detection be capable of decoding the information registered by his brain, locating it in his individual consciousness. For the second condition to be fulfilled, special training is required to achieve an internal silence and a great capacity of concentration. That is, an increase of the signal and a decrease of the background noise. In technical terms, an increase of the signal-noise ratio. The technique to achieve this is meditation. On the other hand, and according to the same Buddhist tradition, not only are there direct interactions between human beings, but even the feeling of possessing an independent and absolute I is illusory and rather results from and is based on processes of interdependence. In the realm of science, similar considerations derive from the analysis of the now famous Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox, or ERP paradox, which was suggested in a paper signed by the three scientists, whose surnames appear above, and was published in an article appearing in 1936. According to the ERP paradox, if two elementary particles interact or arise from the same radioactive process and then separate in space, the modification of one of them is reflected in concomitant changes in the other, regardless of the distance separating them. In 1982, a scientist at the University of Paris, Aspect, succeeded in performing the experiment suggested by the ERP paradox with positive results. These show that there is a basis for the idea that everything is related to each other, and that there is an interdependence between all the particles in the universe that have previously interacted. In the laboratory of Psychophysiology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, I and my collaborators initiated a series of studies about the so-called transferred potential. This potential is an electrophysiological response of a brain that is not sensorially stimulated to the stimulation received by another brain with which a direct communication has been established. Direct communication occurs when two subjects are able to sense each other's presence without the use of sensory signals, such as the other's image, verbalization, tactile contact, or any other physical means of communication. The stimulated subject, e.g. by a light, responds to the stimulus with a provoked potential, i.e. a neuroelectrical response reflecting neuronal activation. The unstimulated subject also responds with another neuronal activation, as if it had also been stimulated. Our early experiments showed that the morphology of the transferred potential was similar to that of the elicited potential, but only appeared to 8% of the actual stimulations. In other words, for every 100 elicited potentials in the stimulated subject, only 8 transferred potentials could be detected. The methodology we used for this experiment consisted in the direct detection of electroencephalographic EEG activity of clear similarities between the activity of the two brains. Since the EEG is very complex, to increase the signal-to-noise ratio, we used the pre-measurement procedure, using a computer specially programmed for this purpose. This procedure consists of taking samples of EEG activity, starting from the application of the stimulus, synchronized with its appearance, and with a variable duration, in this case of 1% of a second, i.e. 250 milliseconds. Each sample synchronized with the stimulus is averaged with the other samples. The portions of the samples that are repeated at each application of the stimulus are summed, while the random EEG activity that is unrelated to the stimulus, the EEG background noise, is cancelled out in the pre-averaging. At the end of several averages, the result is a neuroelectrical change that reflects only that which was repeated, i.e., the actual brain response, the signal, and not the noise. Using this procedure, we found the result described above, i.e., 8% of transferred potentials upon stimulation of one of the subjects. To carry out the research, we first invited the subjects to sit inside a sound-insulated and electromagnetically shielded chamber, in conditions of silence and total darkness. The subjects, with their eyes closed, sensed each other's presence until they were able to establish direct communication. At that point, one of the subjects was invited to move to another chamber, isolated from the first, electromagnetically shielded, and in total darkness. The subject who remained in the original chamber was then stimulated with a series of flashes that his partner in the other chamber did not receive, nor did he know that they were being applied. Both subjects in the two chambers maintained their direct communication throughout the stimulation process. Under these conditions, we recorded the potential elicited in the brain of the stimulated subject and that transferred in the brain of the unstimulated subject. The pre-interaction condition, we assumed, was absolutely necessary to achieve the transfer. For this, we relied on the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox, ERP paradox, which, as we saw earlier, indicates that if two elementary particles establish an interaction and then separate in space, the modification in one of them leads to the concomitant modification of the other, regardless of the distance at which they have separated after their interaction. The results we obtained in the transferred potential experiment indicated that the ERP paradox exists at the level of the human brain, as well as between elementary particles. In other words, if and when an interaction has been established between two human brains, just as between two elementary particles, both brains and particles are bound together, and whatever happens to one of them will affect the other member of the pair. From the point of view of the non-existence of chance, these results form the basis of this non-existence, since they show that objects and subjects that have previously interacted form a kind of network or matrix that links them, and what happens to one of them will affect the other. This condition is basic to assume and accept the non-existence of chance. In a second series of experiments, we tested the condition of prior interaction as an indispensable condition for the establishment of connections between brains. In other words, we questioned its necessity. To this end, we designed a series of experiments in which we would try to record the transferred potential, but from subjects who had not interacted prior to the recording. The experiment consisted of inviting one subject to sit inside a sensory and electromagnetically isolated chamber, and another subject to do the same, but in another chamber also shielded and isolated from sounds. Both subjects did not know each other, had never seen each other, and never interacted with each other. Under these conditions, one of the subjects was stimulated, and the other was not. We recorded the EEG activity of both and used the pre-mediation procedure in order to detect some transferred potential signal in the brain of the unstimulated subject. Unlike the first experiment, in this experiment we exaggerated the accuracy and subtlety of the pre-measurement, first by increasing the number of average samples, until we reached the figure of 512. An average of 512 EEG samples, synchronized with a stimulus, increases the signal-to-noise ratio by a very large amount. Second, we were no longer interested only in detecting the gross and apparent similarity of the two potentials, the elicited and the transferred, but rather in analyzing some trace, however small, of the transferred potential that had the virtue of repeating regardless of its similarity to the elicited potential. To accomplish this analysis, we averaged 256 samples of EEG activity in the unstimulated subject, synchronized with the occurrence of the stimulus in the stimulated subject. Once this averaging was achieved, we continued to stimulate one of the subjects and averaged another 256 samples of EEG activity from the unstimulated subject. Both samples of 256 presentations were compared with each other in order to find any similarities between them. We found that these similarities exist. This result indicates that the brain of the unstimulated subject was able to detect the stimulus or brain response in its partner, even though the two never interacted. In other words, the connection between brains exists, regardless of whether they have interacted previously. This indicates that the intracerebral relationship is naturally occurring and exists under conditions that do not require prior interactions or training procedures in direct communication. This is not to say that detection has to pass the threshold of consciousness to exist. In fact, our subjects, those who showed brain signals of direct detection, were never able to tell us what was happening with their stimulated partner. This indicates that the natural connection between brains is unconscious, or at least does not require consciousness to exist. In terms of the non-existence of chance, these findings indicate that normally all human brains are intertwined and intercommunicated with each other, and that events detected by one brain affect the others, without necessarily being aware of these effects. Extrapolating this conclusion, we can say that everything that one brain detects is detected by the rest, and somehow influences the rest of the brains, modifying them. This modification, according to our results, is very subtle and only detectable using high pre-mediation procedures, i.e., a methodology that substantially increases the signal-to-noise ratio. Based on the experiment described above, we decided to test the possibility that a brain could detect natural events without the need for another brain to be activated. In other words, we wondered whether the non-random activity that we had recorded in the intracerebral experiment without prior interaction was due to brain activation or whether it could occur without the need for the intervention of two brains. To this end, we devised the following experiment. A subject was invited to sit inside an electromagnetically shielded chamber, isolated from sounds, while in another chamber, isolated from the first one and also electromagnetically shielded, a series of flashes were presented, without any subject observing them. To achieve this, the stimulation and pre-mediation procedures were fully automated, so that a computer controlled the experiment without the need for human intervention. On this occasion, 256 flashes were presented, and the corresponding samples of the isolated subject's brain activity averaged. Then, another 256 flashes were presented, and the brain activity synchronized with their appearance was also averaged. Both averages were compared with each other in order to find some similarity that would indicate the existence of a non-random response. The response to this search was positive, i.e., the brain of the unstimulated subject responded to the stimulus, detecting it even though neither subject observed the stimulation maneuver or intervened in the sensory presentation. This surprising result indicates that the human brain is capable of detecting events occurring in the universe, independently of sensory stimulation, and without the need for another brain to have been activated or to have perceived the stimulus in question. The question we immediately raised was about the subtlety of this detection. In other words, the previous experiment used the application of a flash of considerable intensity, maximum intensity, on the grass photostimulator scale. Now we wondered whether the human brain is capable of detecting much lighter stimuli. To answer this question, we disconnected the photoelectric stimulator and only applied a synchronization pulse to obtain the EEG sample and activate the computer pre-measurement program. The synchronization procedure was fully automated, so that no human operator intervened in its application. Under these conditions, the procedure of the previous experiment was repeated, inviting a subject to sit in the shielded and isolated chamber, while his EEG samples were taken synchronized with the electrical synchrony pulse. I want to emphasize the fact that in this experiment, a series of high-intensity flashes is not activated, and that the only stimulus capable of being perceived by anyone was the brief, almost imperceptible light from the GRASS 588 stimulator, which indicated that a synchrony pulse had been activated. Other than that indicator light and the electrical synchrony pulse, 1 millisecond in duration and 1 volt in intensity, no other stimulus was activated. Of course, the synchrony pulse activated a computer with all its circuits running a complex program. And the question we asked ourselves was whether this activation could be directly recorded by a human brain. We averaged 2 sets of 256 EEG samples synchronized with the above-mentioned synchrony pulse, and found, by comparing the two averages, that there were repetitive signals in them. In other words, our results indicated that the human brain responds to subtle stimuli by detecting them directly. This result could be extrapolated to say that the human brain is capable of detecting any event, no matter how subtle. We are currently planning to repeat these experiments, but increasing the distance between the stimulus and the brain that detects it. I dare to predict that we will obtain the same results as before, although we may need to further increase the signal-to-noise ratio to make the non-random brain response evident. These experiments demonstrate that the basis for the non-existence of randomness is the connections between different brains, and between it and objects and events. Our results indicate that we live immersed in a network of relationships, and that the paths that these relationships follow form the basis for the non-existence of chance. Finally, I would like to venture another hypothesis and present some experimental results that support it. According to the synergic theory, every event or physical change results and is a distortion of the matrix or lattice of space-time. Thus, a provoked potential or a transferred potential affects the organization of space-time and therefore could be detected in any animate or non-living system. For example, the activation of a brain could affect the crystalline organization of water, and if this alteration could be detected, it could be shown to be related to brain activation. Precisely to test this possibility, we decided to record the impedance characteristics of a liquid, water impregnated with an electrolyte substance, in the vicinity of a brain, responding to an event. We decided to use and take advantage of the methodology described above, and, for this purpose, a subject isolated from stimuli was recorded when a flash was applied outside his conscious perception, and next to this subject the impedance changes of the water were recorded. We took samples of the subject's EEG activity, synchronized with the stimulus, and at the same time samples of the same duration of water impedance changes, also synchronized with the occurrence of the stimulus. Both samples were averaged, and 2 averages of 256 samples each were compared with each other. We found that in both brain activity and impedance changes, there were repetitive morphologies, indicating that both animate and inanimate systems are able to interact directly. We then did the same with 2 inanimate systems. To do this, we applied a series of flashes in a shielded chamber and recorded the impedance changes in water, located in another electromagnetically shielded chamber. We compared 2 samples of 256 records, and so far we have not been able to find anything repetitive, indicating that an inanimate system is not able to interact directly with another in the absence of a brain to serve as an interface between the two. We plan to increase the signal-to-noise ratio in this experiment, to probe, to the limit of our technical possibilities, for some relationship. According to the ERP paradox, such a relationship should exist, but perhaps in 2 inanimate systems, prior interaction is required. In summary, our results indicate that human brains are naturally interconnected and that alteration in one of them affects the others without the need for prior interactions. Similarly, we find that a brain is able to affect inanimate objects directly, but that two inanimate systems do not affect each other if they have not interacted previously. Conclusions. We have demonstrated at the experimental level that there is a direct interaction between human brains without requiring that they have previously established a contact or interaction, strictly speaking. And if the Big Bang theory is true, everything that exists in the universe, including our brains, emerged from the same superparticle that exploded at the origin of time, and therefore the ERP paradox holds in our experiments. The results we have obtained indicate that all human brains on planet Earth are interconnected and form a network of interactions, which could be the anatomical structure of the brain of Gaia and the physiological and energetic foundation of the planetary consciousness. On the other hand, the evidence described in this chapter indicates that everything that happens in the universe is registered by the human brain, but is not detected in the individual consciousness because of the noise of the system and a lack of training to increase the signal-noise ratio. Awareness of an event arises when the signal-to-noise ratio is increased, making the event stand out from the background noise of the system. Buddhism seems to be right when it states that there is a state of omniscience, because such a state only requires the ability to become conscious and to decode properly what the brain registers and detects already in a natural way. Profound reflections about the nature of consciousness can be derived from our experimental results. First, one would like to think that consciousness exists in everything, and that the human being either focuses it in his sensations of limited identity, or he agrees to perceive himself as the unity to which his brain has access. This unity has several levels, from the human body itself to the collective, the national, the planetary, or the universal. Each level has a body and a brain, although fundamentally they are all co-participants and are sustained by the same consciousness. Secondly, the fact that we are all interconnected and that each one of us is capable of detecting everything that happens in the universe indicates that we are doubly responsible for the progress of the cosmos, because we are receptive to it to the point of being one with it, and because when we are affected by the universal order, we also affect it and participate in it by favoring its good functioning, or, in another way, by opposing it. If we are the hyperneurons of the brain of Gaia, the good consciousness of the unity to which we belong depends on each one of us. Contemporary Kabbalists assert that the true mystery is oneness. A cell in our body receives mysterious influences from the bodily unit to which it belongs, just as each of us receives them from the brain of Gaia and her planetary body. Knowing this, let us act and think feeding Gaia with beauty and love, and that is what we will mysteriously receive and reap. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you love the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. Hugs and God bless you.